Beneath the streets of Mexico and across the border, El Chapo's tunnels weren't just passages, they were the lifelines of a criminal empire that defied every effort to stop it. But as the tunneling short king built his underground kingdom, he never imagined the walls closing in would eventually become the very thing he couldn't escape. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was born into a world of poverty in the rugged mountains of Sinaloa, Mexico, in 1957. His family, poor farmers, lived in a small, isolated community where survival meant doing more than just working the land. From a young age, El Chapo learned that in his world, power was something you built, not inherited. His father, a man of few words, taught him how to grow crops, but more importantly, he taught him how to survive. Life in the hills wasn't just about farming, it was about navigating a world that thrived on secrecy, loyalty, and a strict understanding of who was in control. As a teenager, El Chapo was already showing signs of ambition that went beyond the limitations of his humble origins. He dropped out of school early, not because he couldn't learn, but because the streets offered a different kind of education. He entered the world of drug trafficking, initially as a low-level mule moving small loads, but his sharp mind, coupled with his unassuming demeanor, quickly set him apart. He learned the business from the ground up, understanding the complexities of the smuggling routes that wound through Mexico's northern border and up into the United States. Unlike the flashy cartels of the time, El Chapo's rise was methodical, quiet, and ruthless. By his early 20s, El Chapo had already made a name for himself in the criminal world, not as a gangster who walked around with a swagger, but as a calculating strategist who knew when to strike and when to wait. His first big break came when he became involved with the Guadalajara cartel, working under Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. El Chapo quickly proved himself indispensable, not just for his street smarts, but for his ability to see the bigger picture. While other drug lords focused on gaining control of territory, El Chapo focused on building a system, a network of tunnels, bribes, and loyalty that would one day make him the most feared man in Mexico. He rose swiftly through the ranks, always keeping a low profile, never letting greed cloud his judgment. It wasn't long before he became the right-hand man to Gallardo. But in the world of drug cartels, loyalty is a fleeting thing. Gallardo was arrested, and just like that, the Sinaloa cartel was up for grabs. El Chapo seized the opportunity and, with a series of strategic moves, established himself as the leader of the cartel, securing his position at the top of the drug world. From there, his empire grew, sprawling across borders, fueled by El Chapo's ability to move drugs, money, and people with the efficiency of a machine. He would soon become known not just for his criminal empire, but for his uncanny ability to escape the law time and time again. But before the tunnels that would define his legend, there was only a young man from a mountain village, hungry for something bigger, something that could never be taken away, and that hunger would make him a king. The Sinaloa cartel was born in the early 1980s, a response to the chaotic drug wars that raged across Mexico. Amidst the shifting alliances, betrayals, and bloodshed, a group of seasoned traffickers, including Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, carved out a space for themselves. Gallardo, known as the Godfather, was the mastermind behind the cartel's foundation, and it was under his guidance that the organization grew into a powerful force. At first, the cartel operated with a loose network of independent drug runners and smugglers, but as it expanded, it transformed into a well-oiled machine with El Chapo, still a small player at the time, working his way up from the bottom. El Chapo's journey into the cartel began with small, seemingly insignificant jobs, moving smaller loads of cocaine, marijuana, and heroin. What set him apart was his mind for logistics. While others focused on controlling territory or fighting for dominance, El Chapo saw opportunity in the unnoticed details. He understood how to make the smuggling process smoother, safer, and more profitable. His natural ability to navigate the complex world of cross-border drug trafficking earned him a reputation as someone who could get things done, quietly and efficiently. As Gallardo's cartel grew, so did El Chapo's role within it. He was no longer just a runner but a trusted lieutenant, responsible for managing the logistics of moving massive quantities of drugs. His rise came not from the force of his violence, but from the weight of his cunning. He built relationships with the right people, from the local police to politicians, from the U.S. authorities to the rival cartels. His network stretched far and wide, and as Gallardo's empire solidified, El Chapo played a pivotal role in its operations. It was around this time that El Chapo began to realize the full scale of his potential. He wasn't just a cog in a machine, he was becoming the engine. While Gallardo focused on overseeing the broader cartel operations, El Chapo was on the ground, making moves that would eventually secure him a seat at the top of the cartel hierarchy. The power of the Sinaloa cartel was rooted in its ability to move drugs undetected, and El Chapo, with his knack for staying under the radar, played a huge part in that success. He didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. When Gallardo was arrested in 1989, El Chapo seized the opportunity. The cartel, which had been a tightly knit, centralized operation, splintered as power vacuums formed. But El Chapo, with his carefully cultivated network, knew how to thrive in chaos. He quietly took control, not through force or a violent coup, but through strategy and alliances. Under his leadership, the Sinaloa cartel would grow into one of the most feared and profitable criminal organizations the world had ever seen, and El Chapo would become its king. El Chapo's rise to power was not defined by brute force, but by an almost obsessive attention to detail, an understanding of logistics that many overlooked in the chaos of the drug world. From the very beginning, he knew that to survive, he needed more than just muscle. He needed a system. While many in the drug trade relied on intimidation and fear to control their operations, El Chapo focused on efficiency and secrecy. He wasn't just moving drugs. He was building an empire that could outlast the law, the violence, and even time itself. His method of operation was simple, yet revolutionary. El Chapo understood that drug shipments were a balancing act, an intricate web of timing, routes, and connections. He saw the inefficiencies in the systems that other cartels relied on and set about fixing them. Every detail was important. He mapped routes with the precision of a military strategist, choosing paths that were harder to track, ensuring his shipments moved like shadows through the night. His network of trusted contacts, from local officials to seasoned smugglers, made sure that every load was handled with care and moved with the utmost secrecy. El Chapo's first major shipments were small compared to what he would move in later years, but they were significant nonetheless. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He started with marijuana and smaller quantities of cocaine, and each deal brought him more influence and trust in the world of smuggling. But it wasn't just about the product, it was about building relationships, finding people who could be trusted not to cut corners or make mistakes. His early partnerships were crucial to his success. While other drug lords were busy fighting over territories and dealing with rival cartels, El Chapo quietly built an invisible empire based on the reliability of his operations. He was smart about his partnerships, understanding that in this world, loyalty was more valuable than strength. He wasn't looking to dominate, he was looking to control the flow. His ability to stay out of the spotlight was what made him stand out. While the most famous cartels of the era made their name through violent public displays of power, El Chapo made his name by keeping things moving smoothly behind the scenes. As his operations grew, so did his reach. He began to establish routes that spanned from the jungles of Mexico to the streets of the United States, carving out a network that was as complicated and expansive as any legitimate business. With each shipment, El Chapo didn't just move drugs, He moved himself closer to the top of the cartel world. His business wasn't just about selling a product. It was about creating an enduring, untouchable system. And it was that system, that quiet, efficient hustle, that would lay the foundation for his dominance in the drug trade for years to come. El Chapo's rise to power wasn't a sudden, dramatic takeover. It was a calculated, methodical climb that involved navigating a world where betrayal and violence were everyday currencies. As the Sinaloa cartel expanded, the stakes grew higher, and El Chapo knew that in order to maintain his position, he had to outmaneuver everyone around him. Rival cartels were a constant threat, and it wasn't just about controlling territory. It was about controlling the lifeblood of the trade, the routes, the shipments, and the loyalty of the men who moved the product. In the early 1990s, the Mexican drug trade was in chaos. Cartels like the Tijuana cartel, the Gulf cartel, and the Colombian drug lords were all vying for control, often resulting in bloody, public battles. El Chapo, however, understood that the key to surviving and thriving was in staying one step ahead. While the other cartels fought over power in the streets, El Chapo expanded his influence quietly, focusing on the logistics of smuggling and forging relationships with key figures within the Mexican government, law enforcement, and even the US DEA. His ability to remain undetected in a world full of public showdowns was what set him apart from his competitors. His method was ruthless but clever. El Chapo didn't just rely on the firepower of his sicarios to protect his shipments. He built a network of bribed officials, loyal insiders, and highly trained men who could strike fast and vanish just as quickly. When things got heated, he didn't hesitate to use violence, but he was always strategic about it. He wasn't interested in unnecessary bloodshed. Instead, he targeted those who threatened his operations with precision. Rival cartel leaders who made moves against him often found themselves caught in a web of treachery, unable to escape the reach of El Chapo's growing empire. By the mid-1990s, the Sinaloa cartel had become the largest and most powerful drug cartel in Mexico, but the leadership was fractured. With the downfall of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the Sinaloa cartel was divided, and multiple factions fought for control. El Chapo saw his opportunity and moved quickly. He knew that, to cement his power, he needed to unite the factions under his rule. He used a combination of intimidation, strategic alliances, and the promise of profits to win the loyalty of key cartel members. His vision wasn't just about money. It was about creating a cartel that could last beyond the violence of the moment, a cartel that would endure despite the ever-changing tides of the drug trade. In the late 1990s, El Chapo was officially at the helm of the Sinaloa cartel. He had taken control not just through force, but through patience, strategy, and a ruthless understanding of the system. Under his leadership, the cartel would grow even more powerful, expanding its reach across borders, establishing a foothold in nearly every major city in the United States, and becoming a major player in the international drug trade. But with power came inevitable enemies, and El Chapo's battles were far from over. As his empire grew, so did the number of people who wanted him dead. Yet, he wasn't just a survivor, he was a king in a kingdom built on shadows, and he knew exactly how to defend it. El Chapo's ability to evade the law and rival cartels became one of the defining features of his criminal legend. His name was synonymous with escapes, whether from prison, rival hitmen, or the law itself. But it wasn't just luck or chance. El Chapo was a master of strategy, planning every move with meticulous care, and understanding better than anyone that survival in the drug trade wasn't just about wealth and violence. It was about knowing when to disappear and how to stay hidden in plain sight. In the early days, as El Chapo's influence grew, he began drawing the attention of law enforcement, both in Mexico and the United States. His rapid rise to the top of the Sinaloa cartel didn't go unnoticed, and soon he found himself the target of a massive manhunt. But while most criminals in his position would have crumbled under the pressure, El Chapo excelled. He understood that in his world, a low profile was a necessity. He didn't flaunt his wealth openly, choosing instead to invest it in his empire, buying real estate, building hidden tunnels, and setting up complex routes that could move his product under the radar. To his enemies, he was a ghost. It was during one of his early encounters with the law that El Chapo's reputation as an escape artist first solidified. In 1993, he was arrested in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico, where he faced multiple charges for drug trafficking, murder, and corruption. But it was behind bars that El Chapo's true ingenuity came to light. His time in prison, while far from peaceful, was the beginning of his legendary escapes. He built relationships with the guards, bribing them to look the other way while he constructed a network of tunnels, a system he would come to rely on time and time again. The first escape, though seemingly improbable, was executed with chilling precision. El Chapo slipped away through a tunnel that had been carved beneath the prison walls, disappearing into the night, his capture slipping through the fingers of law enforcement once again. After that, El Chapo became nearly untouchable. His ability to evade, capture, and eliminate threats was remarkable. Rival cartels, who once saw him as just another ambitious player, began to realize that El Chapo was something different. His influence spread beyond the cartel world, reaching politicians, judges, and law enforcement officers. They either aided him or became his targets, swept away in the wake of his ambition. He became a shadow, a figure that could not be pinned down, a legend who could not be contained. In 2015, El Chapo pulled off perhaps his most famous escape, a daring feat from the Altiplano maximum security prison in Mexico. A tunnel, so sophisticated it even had lighting and ventilation, allowed him to escape yet again. The escape was as much a statement as it was a success, cementing his place in history as the ultimate escape artist. Each time the walls closed in, El Chapo found a way out. It wasn't just about running. It was about controlling the spaces he inhabited, bending the world around him to fit his needs. But the cost of such evasion was high. Each escape made him more infamous, but it also made him more of a target, and each time, the walls grew tighter. Yet, for El Chapo, it wasn't just survival, it was the art of the escape. El Chapo's tunnel network became the hallmark of his cartel's operations, a testament to his ingenuity and deep understanding of the logistics that ruled the drug trade. While others relied on traditional methods, planes, trucks, and boats, El Chapo innovated, creating a subterranean empire that would come to define his smuggling operations. The tunnels were more than just a means of transportation. They were a symbol of El Chapo's meticulous, strategic approach to crime. They allowed him to move vast quantities of drugs from Mexico into the United States, under the radar of authorities, making his cartel nearly impossible to trace or dismantle. The tunnels were sophisticated, far beyond what most imagined. These weren't simple dugouts. They were engineering feats. Each tunnel had been planned with precision. They were long, often stretching hundreds of meters beneath the earth, designed to be nearly invisible. El Chapo's team of engineers and architects built them with lighting, ventilation systems, and reinforced walls, making them suitable for large shipments of cocaine, marijuana, and heroin. Some even had rail systems to move the drugs more quickly, ensuring a smooth, nearly flawless transit. The ingenuity of these tunnels lay in their ability to remain undetected. Positioned in remote areas, they allowed El Chapo to evade customs inspections and law enforcement, moving his product directly from the underground to the bustling streets of the United States. But the tunnels were more than just a tool for smuggling. They were a statement. They symbolized the lengths El Chapo was willing to go to outsmart authorities and rival cartels. He didn't just operate in plain sight. He worked beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively. His tunnels were a reflection of his calculated, patient approach to building power. The network wasn't just about avoiding detection, it was about making his cartel's operations seamless, invisible, and incredibly efficient. Law enforcement could raid a warehouse, seize a shipment, or shut down a distribution route, but the tunnels remained a constant. The supply never truly stopped. These underground passages became a key part of the Sinaloa cartel's dominance in the drug trade, allowing them to maintain a constant flow of narcotics into the U.S. without interference. In fact, the tunnels were so effective that authorities found it difficult to keep up. By the time they caught wind of one tunnel, another would already be operational, often just a few miles away. For El Chapo, the tunnels weren't just a way to move drugs. They were a way to stay ahead, to remain untouchable. They allowed him to maintain control over the drug trade, even as law enforcement and rival cartels took shots at him from every direction. His tunnels were his lifeblood, his escape routes, and his greatest tool in building an empire that could not be contained. As the years passed, El Chapo's tunnel system grew more complex, more extensive, and more dangerous. They became a part of his legacy, a reminder of how far he was willing to go to maintain control, to evade capture, and to continue his reign as the king of the drug trade. The Mexico, U.S. border has long been the dividing line for drug cartels, a physical and symbolic barrier between two worlds. But for El Chapo, it was never an obstacle, it was an opportunity. The border, with its vast stretches of desert, mountains, and remote areas, was the perfect place to exploit weaknesses in the system. Law enforcement and military forces were spread thin across its length, trying to keep up with an ever-evolving network of smugglers, cartels, and traffickers. El Chapo knew this, and like any great strategist, he understood that borders, when manipulated correctly, could be as porous as they were meant to be solid. He didn't just use the border, he bent it to his will. For years, authorities had focused on the most obvious routes: trucks, vehicles, planes. But El Chapo saw the border as a more subtle challenge, one that required patience and ingenuity. While other cartels relied on brute force or conventional methods, El Chapo made his name by going under the radar, literally. His tunnel network was his weapon of choice, a strategy that exploited the vastness and vulnerabilities of the border in ways that no one could have anticipated. The tunnels, often dug deep below the surface, allowed him to move drugs from Mexico into the United States undetected. Customs, with all its screening technology and heavy monitoring, simply couldn't reach what was hidden beneath. The tunnels were his secret weapon, but the real genius lay in how they bypassed the most scrutinized areas of the border. While guards and patrols focused on the land, the sky, and the rivers, El Chapo's operation worked in the shadows. He understood that the border itself wasn't just a physical line, it was a system, and that system had flaws, gaps in its armor that he knew how to find and exploit. The tunnels he built became arteries through which his cartel moved a constant stream of cocaine, marijuana, and heroin into the U.S. Without these passages, the flow would have been slowed, if not stopped entirely. But with them, the product moved like clockwork, invisible and undetectable to the forces trying to stop him. Over the years, his tunnel network evolved, becoming more complex and sophisticated. What started as crude, hand-dug shafts in remote desert locations turned into high-tech pathways equipped with lighting, ventilation, and even rail systems. It was no longer just about getting the drugs across. It was about doing so quickly, quietly, and efficiently. El Chapo had taken the border, a line meant to separate two worlds, and turned it into a tool that worked for him. The border, which many saw as an impenetrable obstacle, became a bridge, And in the end, it was this subtle, yet devastatingly effective tactic that allowed El Chapo to remain untouchable for so long. His empire thrived not just because of its size or power, but because he understood one simple truth: borders are only as strong as the people who defend them. And El Chapo knew exactly how to slip through the cracks. El Chapo's rise to the top of the Sinaloa cartel didn't come easily. It was a constant battle, not just against law enforcement, but against rival drug lords, factions within his own ranks, and the brutal politics that came with controlling one of the largest drug empires in history. In the world of cartels, loyalty was often fleeting, and betrayal was never far away. Power wasn't given. It had to be seized, fought for, and protected at all costs. El Chapo knew this well. His every move was calculated, not just in terms of money or business, but in the violent, deadly game of positioning, alliances, and rivalries. At the heart of his empire, El Chapo constantly fought to maintain control, even as his power grew. The world of the Sinaloa cartel was one of shifting alliances, betrayal, and bloodshed. As he rose through the ranks, El Chapo had to eliminate rivals within the cartel who threatened his hold over the organization. These were men who once stood beside him, men who trusted him, but as his power expanded, so did the fractures in his organization. Cartel leaders who were once loyal began to question his authority, seeing El Chapo as a man who couldn't be trusted with the future of the cartel. They wanted more power, more control. And in the cutthroat world of drug lords, that meant blood. El Chapo responded with ruthlessness. He didn't hesitate to strike when necessary, cutting down those who were disloyal or who stood in the way of his ambitions. This wasn't just about business, it was about survival. Every move he made was part of a strategy to secure his position at the top, and sometimes that meant betraying those closest to him. But betrayal wasn't always a one-sided affair. Rival cartels like the Zetas, the Gulf Cartel, and the Beltran Leyva organization constantly challenged El Chapo's rule, attempting to carve out their own territories, seize his roots, and undercut his influence. These rivalries were fierce, bloody, and relentless. No one was safe, not even El Chapo himself. But the greatest battles didn't always happen in the open. They were fought in the shadows, silent wars of influence, manipulation, and shifting allegiances. El Chapo was a master of these behind-the-scenes battles. He knew how to play the game of cartel politics, forging alliances with other drug lords when necessary, only to discard them once they were no longer useful. He played both sides, using loyalty and betrayal as weapons to secure his empire. And just as easily as he made alliances, he could break them. His ability to manipulate, to play rival cartels against each other, and to survive the constant threats from within and outside his organization was what set him apart from others. He wasn't just a drug lord, he was a tactician, a master of navigating the complex and dangerous world of cartel politics. In the end, El Chapo's empire was built on both fear and loyalty, a fragile balance that was constantly under threat. But he thrived in this chaos, using it to his advantage, always staying one step ahead of those who would challenge him. His ability to navigate the dangerous, shifting landscape of cartel politics allowed him to not just survive, but to dominate. As El Chapo's influence grew, so did his empire. What began as a small-time operation in the mountains of Sinaloa quickly evolved into a sprawling network that reached across Mexico, into the United States, and beyond. El Chapo had a unique understanding of logistics, distribution, and the global drug trade. His ability to adapt and expand into various markets was what set him apart from other drug lords. He wasn't just running a cartel, he was running a multinational, complex business empire built on smuggling routes, corrupt officials, and a carefully orchestrated web of violence and loyalty. El Chapo's empire wasn't confined to the familiar corridors of drug trafficking. He expanded his reach into cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and methamphetamine production, dominating the trade on both sides of the border. The United States, with its insatiable demand for drugs, was his prime market, but his influence stretched far beyond the borders of Mexico. He took control of key trafficking routes into Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico, ensuring his products moved smoothly and swiftly, bypassing law enforcement and rival cartels. His operation was one of the largest and most sophisticated in the world. To accomplish this, El Chapo knew that he needed more than just a solid network. He needed people, drivers, pilots, chemists, and soldiers. The workers under his command weren't just employees. They were loyal, often bound by blood or shared history. He brought his family and friends into the business, securing loyalty from within. He expanded his operation into rural areas where the law had little presence, using these regions as bases for manufacturing and distribution. Each new territory he took over was a piece added to the growing mosaic of his empire. El Chapo was also a master of adapting to changing circumstances. When the U.S. and Mexican authorities cracked down on one of his methods of transportation, he quickly shifted gears, expanding his use of tunnels beneath the border, drug-laden submarines, and airplanes with modified cargo compartments. He became an expert at staying one step ahead of law enforcement, constantly innovating to find new ways to move his product. As his empire expanded, so did his reputation. El Chapo's name became synonymous with power, violence, and influence, not just in the cartel world, but in the broader public consciousness. He wasn't just another drug lord, he was a figure of legend. He had what most cartel leaders lacked: a keen sense for maintaining his image, understanding the value of public perception. He played the media as deftly as he played his rivals, giving interviews, creating alliances with politicians, and making sure that the world knew his name. Through his expansion and growth, El Chapo solidified his position as one of the most powerful drug lords in history. The empire he built wasn't just about wealth. It was about control, domination, and legacy. The money flowed in rivers, but it was the power, the untouchable feeling that came with it, that truly made him a legend. El Chapo was not just a ruthless criminal mastermind. He was a complex individual whose personality and leadership style played a crucial role in building and maintaining his empire. Unlike other drug lords who operated in the shadows, El Chapo was known for his ability to maintain a low profile while still exerting an iron grip over his operations. His quiet demeanor and reserved nature masked a mind that was always calculating, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He was a man of few words but immense influence, leading through fear, respect, and loyalty rather than charisma or grand gestures. What made El Chapo such a powerful figure was his ability to manage his vast, sprawling cartel like a well-oiled machine. The Sinaloa cartel was a multi-billion-dollar business, and El Chapo ran it with precision. He knew every detail of his operation, from the distribution of drugs to the locations of his secret hideouts. But he didn't get bogged down in the minutiae. Instead, he built a network of trusted lieutenants and partners who took care of the day-to-day operations. El Chapo's role was one of oversight, making the key decisions, orchestrating major deals, and ensuring that his empire continued to grow, even when law enforcement and rival cartels closed in. He surrounded himself with family and childhood friends, a network of loyalty that ensured there were no leaks within his organization. Despite his reputation for violence, El Chapo didn't lead through sheer brutality alone. He understood the importance of loyalty and mutual benefit. He treated his associates well, paying them handsomely and ensuring their families were taken care of. This created a deep sense of loyalty within his ranks, making it easier to manage such a large operation. His cartel wasn't just an organization, it was a family, and El Chapo made sure that those who worked for him knew they would be protected unless, of course, they betrayed him. Loyalty was the cornerstone of his leadership, and those who broke it paid the price. El Chapo's motivations were simple yet profound: power, wealth, and legacy. While the money flowed freely, it was the control and influence over a vast empire that drove him. He was a man obsessed with maintaining his power, constantly thinking of ways to outsmart both law enforcement and his rivals. His ability to adapt to ever-changing circumstances made him a formidable leader. Whether it was expanding his trafficking routes, developing new methods of smuggling, or creating alliances with other criminal organizations, El Chapo was always one step ahead. But there was a darker side to El Chapo's leadership. As his empire grew, so did his paranoia. He trusted fewer people, surrounded himself with more security, and relied on his ability to move unseen, almost like a shadow in the night. The very success that made him so powerful also made him a target. His leadership, once based on loyalty and respect, became a fragile web that he constantly had to defend against the ever-present threats of betrayal and law enforcement. El Chapo's first capture came in 1993 when he was arrested by Mexican authorities, marking the beginning of a series of high-profile run-ins with the law. The capture was not the result of a single operation, but rather a culmination of years of pursuit. By then, El Chapo had firmly established himself as one of the most powerful drug lords in the world, and his operations had grown so expansive that he became a marked man. The Mexican government, with pressure mounting from the U.S., launched an intensive manhunt, using every tool at their disposal to track him down. The final capture occurred in a small neighborhood in Guadalajara, where El Chapo was taken by surprise. It was a brutal reminder of the consequences of living a life built on constant evasion. After his arrest, El Chapo was imprisoned in the maximum security Altiplano prison, a place designed to house Mexico's most dangerous criminals. Yet, even behind bars, El Chapo's influence did not wane. Known for his meticulous planning and network of loyalists, he quickly asserted control over the prison's operations. Reports suggest that he continued to oversee drug shipments, making calls to his cartel members and ensuring the business ran smoothly from inside his cell. He had become so adept at running things from behind bars that it was said that his power had grown, not diminished, during his time in prison. During his imprisonment, El Chapo remained a central figure in the drug trade, manipulating his operations from within the prison walls. He used his contacts, both inside and outside the prison, to maintain communication with his lieutenants, ensuring that orders were carried out and loyalty was kept intact. The prison walls, far from being a restriction, became another layer of his empire, a place where he could consolidate his power and bide his time. His time in Altiplano prison wasn't without its attempts to escape. The first hints of what would become El Chapo's legacy as an escape artist were already on display during this period. He orchestrated a daring plan to tunnel his way out. In 2001, with the help of his inner circle, he managed to escape through a tunnel that led him directly to freedom, making a mockery of the authorities who thought they had him securely contained. The escape was nothing short of spectacular, demonstrating once again that El Chapo's ability to evade capture was as legendary as his rise to power. While in prison, El Chapo didn't just survive, he thrived. His empire was far-reaching, and his ability to maintain control from behind bars revealed the depth of his influence. His arrest and imprisonment were supposed to be the beginning of the end, but instead, they only fueled his determination to reclaim his empire and, in time, led to even more audacious escapes. The first capture had been a setback, but it would prove to be just another chapter in the saga of El Chapo's reign over the world of narco-trafficking. El Chapo's first prison break was nothing short of legendary, a feat that showcased his audacity, cunning, and unparalleled ability to plan. After being captured in 1993 and sent to the Altiplano prison, Authorities believed they had finally secured the most dangerous man in the world. But El Chapo had different plans. Behind bars, he remained a figure of power, even more dangerous for his ability to manipulate those around him. In the years following his capture, he had access to a network of loyalists both inside and outside the prison, and he quietly orchestrated one of the most daring escapes in the history of organized crime. The plan was simple in its execution but complex in its detail. El Chapo's loyalists, always prepared to follow his every command, arranged for a tunnel to be built beneath the prison, one that would provide a way out. The tunnel itself was an engineering marvel, stretching over a mile, dug with such precision that it was nearly impossible to detect. It began in the shower area of his cell, a place where no one would think to look. The tunnel itself was equipped with lighting, ventilation, and even a motorcycle to speed up the getaway. El Chapo had always been a man of detail, and this was no different. Every factor was accounted for, from the timing of the guards' shifts to the location of the tunnel's exit, which led to a house on the outskirts of the prison. On the day of the escape, El Chapo simply disappeared from his cell. The prison staff, none the wiser, believed he was still locked inside. The tunnel, hidden beneath the concrete floors, allowed him to move quickly and quietly. For hours, no one noticed that one of the most dangerous men on the planet had slipped through their fingers. By the time the authorities realized what had happened, El Chapo was already free, speeding away on the motorcycle, leaving behind a trail of baffled and embarrassed prison officials. El Chapo's escape was more than just an escape from prison, it was a statement. It sent a powerful message to the world. No matter how high the walls, no matter how much security, El Chapo was untouchable. His escape was meticulously planned, carried out with surgical precision, and executed in the dead of night, under the very noses of the authorities. For those who had followed his rise, this break only added to his legend. It was a perfect example of the lengths to which El Chapo would go to maintain control of his empire. As news of the escape spread, it became clear that the man who had outsmarted the Mexican government once again was a force to be reckoned with. His reign over the Sinaloa cartel was far from over. Instead, it had entered a new chapter, one where he would only grow more elusive, more dangerous, and more powerful. The first prison break was only the beginning of El Chapo's history of evading capture, solidifying his status as one of the most elusive criminals of all time. After El Chapo's audacious escape from Altiplano in 2001, the manhunt to capture him was nothing short of relentless. Authorities, both in Mexico and abroad, were left scrambling in the wake of his disappearance. The world was stunned. How could someone so dangerous, so elusive, slip through their fingers so easily? It wasn't just a national embarrassment, it was an international crisis. El Chapo, the leader of one of the most powerful drug cartels in the world, was free once again, and no one knew where he would strike next. The Mexican government immediately launched a massive operation to find him, using every resource at their disposal. The military, federal police, and local law enforcement were all mobilized, but it quickly became clear that El Chapo's ability to evade capture was beyond anything they had prepared for. As the days turned to weeks, and weeks into months, the hunt for him intensified. His network was vast, and his allies were loyal, making it nearly impossible for authorities to break through his defenses. It wasn't just about tracking him down. It was about dismantling an entire empire of logistics, corruption, and secrecy. The United States, seeing the global implications of El Chapo's freedom, joined the hunt. The DEA, CIA, and other intelligence agencies offered their expertise, providing surveillance, tracking technology, and specialized resources to assist in the search. They worked alongside the Mexican authorities, sharing intelligence, coordinating operations, and exchanging tips. The world's most powerful law enforcement agencies, united in the effort to track down one man, created a net so vast it stretched across continents. The cartel, however, wasn't just a criminal organization, it was an ecosystem. El Chapo's operation was spread across multiple countries, with drug routes running from South America to the United States and beyond. His empire was built on secrecy and trust, and as long as those who worked for him remained loyal, he had a network that could help him stay hidden for years. The hunt for El Chapo wasn't just about finding him, it was about breaking down that network, a task that proved far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Despite the massive manhunt, El Chapo proved time and again that he was a master of the game. He used his knowledge of the land, his resources, and his people to stay one step ahead. Safe houses were emptied in the blink of an eye. Phones were switched daily. His movements were always carefully calculated, leaving authorities with little more than a trail of smoke and mirrors. Years passed, and the world's attention on El Chapo began to wane. But for those who were still hunting him, there was no rest. His capture became an obsession, a fixation that stretched across borders and continents. His name was on the lips of world leaders and law enforcement officials alike, and the chase had become as much about justice as it was about proving that no one, no matter how powerful, was untouchable. The hunt for El Chapo was a game of cat and mouse, and the mouse had mastered the art of evasion. El Chapo's family was more than just a support system, it was the backbone of his empire. While his cartel was built on violence, secrecy, and intimidation, it was his family's loyalty and involvement that helped it run like a well-oiled machine. Joaquin Guzman was no stranger to using his family to maintain control, and they were more than willing participants in his vision. The Sinaloa cartel wasn't just about power and money for El Chapo. It was about ensuring the survival of his legacy, and his family was his greatest asset in that pursuit. His wife, Emma Coronel Aispuro, was a key figure in the operation. She was more than just the mother of his children. She was a trusted confidant, someone who helped him manage the logistics of his empire. Emma, a former beauty queen, became intertwined in El Chapo's business from the start, even before their marriage. Though her role was often subtle, she was deeply involved in the cartel's affairs, especially in terms of coordinating movements, shipments, and maintaining the illusion of normalcy. It was clear that El Chapo saw in her a partner in both life and crime, someone who could manage the family front while he orchestrated the cartel's many operations. But it wasn't just Emma who was involved. El Chapo's children, too, became part of his world. His sons, particularly Ivan and Alfredo, were groomed to take over the reins when the time came. As El Chapo's empire expanded, so did their roles within it. Ivan, for instance, was rumored to have been a part of the inner circle, handling cartel affairs and helping manage the connections between the drug routes in Mexico and the U.S. While they were still young, the Guzman children were already being prepared for the inevitable transition of power. Family dinners were no longer just about food. They were about reinforcing the empire, instilling loyalty, and ensuring that everyone knew their place in the grand design. El Chapo's relationship with his children was both affectionate and strategic. He showered them with love, often indulging in their every wish, yet there was always an underlying expectation that they would follow in his footsteps. His love for them wasn't about keeping them safe from the world. It was about preparing them for the world he had built. He would often boast about them to his inner circle, talking about how they were his true legacy, the ones who would continue his work even after his downfall. Despite the dark world El Chapo was creating, his family gave him a sense of stability, a reminder of his humanity in the midst of chaos. Yet, the ties between them also made them vulnerable. The more they were involved, the more exposed they became to law enforcement, rival cartels, and the endless threats that followed El Chapo wherever he went. For a man who had built an empire on fear, the greatest danger might have been not just the law, but losing the family that kept him grounded in a world where nothing else seemed real. The extradition battle of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman became one of the most high-profile legal and political struggles in modern history. When El Chapo was captured in 2016, his fate was already a topic of global interest. The U.S. government wasted no time in demanding his extradition, knowing that bringing the infamous drug lord to American soil would not only weaken the Sinaloa cartel, but also deal a significant blow to the international drug trade. However, the fight to send him to the United States was far from simple. The legal process surrounding El Chapo's extradition was a spectacle in itself. While the U.S. had a strong case against him, charging him with a wide array of crimes including drug trafficking, money laundering, and involvement in multiple murders, the Mexican government was hesitant to comply. Mexico's legal system and its political landscape were caught in a web of contradictions, unsure of how to handle the extradition of a figure so deeply entrenched in the country's criminal and political fabric. El Chapo's lawyers immediately began a legal defense to block the extradition, citing various technicalities and arguing that he would not receive a fair trial in the United States. They focused on the conditions of confinement that awaited him in U.S. prisons, specifically the threat of solitary confinement and the brutal treatment he might face. The legal battle was not just about avoiding the U.S. prison system, it was about El Chapo's survival, and every legal argument was an attempt to buy time. Politically, the extradition case was even more complicated. Mexican politicians were deeply divided. Some argued that the extradition was in the best interests of justice, ensuring that El Chapo faced the charges he deserved in the U.S., where he would likely receive a harsher sentence. Others were wary of the diplomatic consequences. The extradition of a man so influential in the country's underworld threatened to create a political firestorm, especially as El Chapo's connections stretched deep into the Mexican elite. There were also concerns about the potential backlash from powerful figures within the Mexican drug cartels who had a vested interest in protecting their kingpin, the U.S. There was calling for justice, but for many in Mexico, the extradition was a matter of national sovereignty. The tension grew as the months passed. El Chapo's supporters and detractors continued to wage a war of words in the media, while behind closed doors, negotiations were taking place at the highest levels of government. The Mexican public was polarized. Some saw him as a hero, a symbol of resistance against a corrupt state, while others saw him as a criminal mastermind deserving of justice on American soil. In the end, Mexico's decision was made, and El Chapo was extradited to the U.S. in 2017. The political ramifications of the case reverberated for years, as it highlighted the complexities of the war on drugs and the deep-rooted corruption that allowed figures like El Chapo to thrive. His extradition may have been a legal victory, but it also exposed the uncomfortable truths about the intersection of crime, politics, and diplomacy. Building the tunnels that allowed Joaquin El Chapo Guzman to escape prison was not only an act of defiance against the Mexican government, but also a testament to his ingenuity and the lengths to which he would go to maintain control. These tunnels became the cornerstone of his legend, a symbol of both his cunning and the vast criminal empire that he ran from behind the scenes. The logistics behind constructing the tunnels were complex and required a team of skilled individuals, including engineers, construction workers, and experts in tunneling techniques. The project was meticulously planned, as every detail had to be accounted for. The tunnel's path had to be precise, avoiding detection by prison officials and law enforcement agencies, while also ensuring that it was structurally sound enough to be used for a daring escape. The first step in the operation was identifying a location within the prison, where the tunnel would begin. The team worked from the inside, secretly building a small opening in the prison's concrete walls, making sure that the work went unnoticed. Once the tunnel was begun, it stretched for over a mile, leading to a warehouse outside the prison grounds. The warehouse, previously outfitted with a sophisticated system of machinery, would conceal the tunnel's exit point. To keep the project hidden, El Chapo's operatives used a variety of methods to avoid detection. They smuggled in materials piece by piece, using intricate schemes to hide the construction work. The construction was often carried out at night, with a select few trusted individuals working in secrecy. There was no room for error, as the consequences of discovery were dire, not just for those involved, but for the cartel itself. As the tunnel began to take shape, its construction became a work of art. It was reinforced with steel beams, had electric lighting installed along the walls, and even featured a ventilation system to ensure a continuous airflow. This wasn't just a tunnel. It was a sophisticated underground network that had been built with the precision of a military operation. The craftsmanship was so meticulous that it could easily have passed as a legitimate construction project if it weren't for its secret purpose. The tunnel was the ultimate escape route, allowing El Chapo to flee the maximum security prison with the ease of someone walking through a door. The operation was so well executed that when El Chapo made his escape, it was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The authorities were left scrambling, unable to explain how he had escaped without a trace. In many ways, the tunnels were a symbol of El Chapo's dominance in the drug trade, his ability to outsmart authorities, evade capture, and maintain control from the shadows. They weren't just a means of escape. They were a statement. The tunnels had become a defining feature of his empire, marking the lengths to which he would go to protect his power. Even in prison, El Chapo proved that his reach extended far beyond the confines of concrete walls. After El Chapo's daring escape from prison, it didn't take long for him to reassert his dominance over the Sinaloa cartel. In the months that followed his dramatic escape, he returned to the criminal landscape with an intensity that shocked even his most loyal allies. He had spent years in prison, and now, free once again, he was determined to reclaim everything he had lost and rebuild his empire to an even greater scale. The Sinaloa cartel, although weakened by his absence, had remained a formidable force, but without its leader, the cartel had splintered into factions, each vying for control of territory and influence. The leadership vacuum was obvious, and rival cartels saw an opportunity to gain ground. However, El Chapo's return was swift and ruthless. His reach, once global, spread like wildfire through Mexico's criminal underworld, rekindling alliances, silencing enemies, and reclaiming territories one by one. Violence spiked in the wake of his return. El Chapo's reputation as a ruthless strategist and formidable leader fueled a new wave of bloodshed. It wasn't just about drugs anymore. It was about reasserting control and punishing those who had dared to take what was his. His ability to outmaneuver rivals and orchestrate violence with pinpoint precision became his trademark. Whether it was through coordinated assassinations or high-stakes firefights, El Chapo's presence was felt in every corner of Mexico's drug trade. He rebuilt the Sinaloa cartel with the same tenacity and brilliance that had made him one of the most powerful men in the world. His network of loyalists, who had never wavered in their faith in him, proved instrumental in his return to power. These were the men who had spent years in the shadows, keeping his empire intact while he languished behind bars. Many of them had been groomed by El Chapo himself, trained to think like him, to act like him, and to be as relentless as he was. They knew the stakes of his return and were willing to follow his orders without question. With them by his side, El Chapo quickly regained control over his old operations, picking up where he had left off. But rebuilding his empire wasn't without its challenges. The Mexican government, alongside U.S. authorities, had increased their focus on him and his cartel. The pressure mounted as law enforcement efforts intensified, but El Chapo was no stranger to evading capture. His connections, his ability to outsmart the authorities, and his years of experience navigating the criminal world made him nearly untouchable. He was a man who had always operated from the shadows, and now, with a renewed sense of purpose, he had returned to his throne. The violence and the rebuilding of his empire were a stark reminder that El Chapo was not a man to be underestimated. He had been knocked down before, but each time, he rose again, more powerful than ever. His return to power was not just a victory for him, it was a statement. The Sinaloa cartel would remain the most powerful drug empire in the world, and as long as El Chapo walked free, it would stay that way. El Chapo's empire was not just a cartel, it was a meticulously crafted machine that spanned continents and wove together a network of drugs, people, and money with unparalleled efficiency. His reach extended from the heart of Mexico to every corner of the globe, with a vast infrastructure built to move narcotics, launder money, and maintain control over the territories he claimed. Each piece of his network was integral, from the supply chains of raw materials to the hands that distributed his product across borders. At the heart of the Sinaloa cartel was a well-oiled operation that moved tons of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana, much of it from Colombia, through Mexico, and up into the United States. El Chapo controlled every link in the chain, ensuring that his product was always in demand, no matter the cost or risk. His control over the supply lines was staggering. He orchestrated shipments through hidden tunnels, concealed vehicles, and airstrips tucked away in remote locations, with no end to the ingenuity he applied to evade law enforcement. Each shipment was planned with military precision, the logistics managed with the same care as a global corporation. To maintain this vast operation, El Chapo relied on a network of loyalists, many of whom were family members or trusted allies who had been with him for years. He had foot soldiers who handled street-level distribution, managers who oversaw regional territories, and skilled individuals who worked the behind-the-scenes machinery of his empire. Every level of his organization was deeply compartmentalized to avoid detection, with each person only knowing as much as they needed to in order to perform their role. Trust was paramount, and El Chapo ensured that his operations ran smoothly by using strict measures to keep the flow of information tight. Money was, of course, the lifeblood of the cartel, and El Chapo had an intricate system for laundering the proceeds of his business. Cash flowed in from drug sales at staggering rates, and keeping it hidden from authorities was a delicate art. He used everything from real estate investments to businesses in legitimate sectors like agriculture and retail, all designed to clean the millions he made daily. Banks, shell companies, and even the involvement of government officials helped him move money under the radar. But El Chapo was always careful. He never left a paper trail, and always operated under layers of complexity, making his financial empire just as elusive as his drug network. To distribute his products, El Chapo had an army of people in place, from truck drivers to pilots, all operating on his behalf. His planes flew under the radar, his boats moved silently across the seas, and his trucks transported goods through highways and back roads that law enforcement couldn't even track. Every member of his organization had a specific role to play, and with every operation executed flawlessly, the network flourished. El Chapo wasn't just a kingpin, he was the mastermind of an empire built on fear, loyalty, and the unrelenting desire for power. His network was his legacy, an empire stretching across countries and continents, with his name whispered in the corners of cities, carried in the pockets of his trusted allies, and always, just beneath the surface, fueling the global demand for illicit goods. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman wasn't a towering figure in the traditional sense. Standing at just 5'6", his physical stature was far from imposing compared to the larger-than-life persona he crafted. Yet, in the world of organized crime, El Chapo's presence was undeniable. His influence stretched far beyond his height, and what he lacked in physicality, he made up for in ruthless cunning, strategic brilliance, and an iron grip on power. His ability to control and expand the Sinaloa cartel was a testament to his capacity to think much larger than his frame would suggest. In the world of drug lords, where dominance is often marked by imposing figures and violent acts, El Chapo stood out for his ability to remain both small in stature and massive in influence. The short king persona became part of his mythos, with many looking at his height as an ironic contrast to the vast empire he controlled. Yet, to the people who feared him, he wasn't just a short man, he was the king of the drug trade, a force that commanded respect from government officials, rival cartels, and his own cartel members alike. His size didn't matter. His strategy, his mind, and his reputation did. The myth of El Chapo, the short king, grew as he outsmarted law enforcement, escaped from prisons, and moved mountains of illicit goods without ever appearing larger than life in physical form. There was an eerie power in his quiet demeanor, a reminder that the biggest threats often come in the smallest packages. In his world, it wasn't the brawn that mattered, it was the brain. El Chapo thrived not by brute force, but by controlling information, forging unbreakable loyalties, and planning every move with meticulous detail. Behind the myth of the short king was a man who knew how to control the narrative. While his rivals painted him as a cruel, ruthless dictator, El Chapo's public image was often one of a humble man, someone who gave back to his community, funded soccer fields, and built homes for the poor. The reality, however, was much darker. Beneath the charitable facade was a man capable of orchestrating some of the most violent and dangerous acts imaginable. He was a symbol of contradiction, beloved by the masses, yet feared by those who truly understood his reach. His short king status wasn't just a clever marketing tool, it became the foundation of his myth. It allowed him to remain a shadow, lurking just out of sight, even as his cartel controlled swaths of territory. While others in his position might have flaunted their power, El Chapo remained calm, composed, and, in many ways, underestimated. The combination of his short stature and immense power made him an enigmatic figure in the world of crime, a paradox that only enhanced his legacy. As much as the world tried to define him by his size, it was always his mind and ambition that set him apart, qualities far more powerful than any physical measurement could convey. El Chapo's role in the drug war between Mexico and the United States was undeniable, as he became a central figure in one of the most deadly and lucrative conflicts in modern history. His Sinaloa cartel wasn't just a supplier of drugs, it was a force that fueled the U.S. drug epidemic for decades, pouring cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine into the American market. While law enforcement on both sides of the border tried to crack down on the flow of narcotics, El Chapo and his empire adapted and evolved, always staying one step ahead of the authorities. The drug war wasn't just about drugs, it was about power, money, and the control of lives, both in the U.S. and Mexico. The United States, with its insatiable demand for drugs, provided the perfect market for El Chapo's operations. He became intimately familiar with the inner workings of the U.S. drug market, its roots, its buyers, and its vulnerabilities. His ability to navigate these systems, from the drug-infested streets of inner cities to the high-level connections in the political and law enforcement circles, solidified his influence. The cartel was known for its efficiency, delivering massive quantities of drugs across the U.S.-Mexico border with ease. From tunnels beneath the border to hidden compartments in cars and trucks, El Chapo utilized every means necessary to move his product undetected. But his relationship with the American drug market wasn't limited to logistics. El Chapo's influence in the United States was also deeply embedded in corruption. The cartel's ability to bribe law enforcement, government officials, and even politicians on both sides of the border allowed him to maintain a stronghold over the trade. These relationships allowed his operations to run smoothly, despite the seemingly constant pressure from U.S. authorities. El Chapo understood that in the world of illegal drugs, money was power. As the leader of one of the most powerful cartels, he made sure that his empire had the resources to influence the system to his advantage, despite his dominance in the U.S. drug market. El Chapo's relationship with American law enforcement was contentious. The U.S. government, particularly the DEA, had made it a priority to bring him down. From raids to wiretaps, the pursuit of El Chapo was relentless. His capture in 2016 by U.S. authorities marked a significant blow to the cartel, but his reputation within the U.S. continued to linger. The arrest, however, was just one chapter in a long and bloody battle that saw many casualties, both on the side of the law and the cartels. His ability to escape prison twice and evade authorities for years made him a symbol of the futility of the war on drugs and a reminder of the limitations of law enforcement against a man who was able to exploit every loophole and weakness in the system. El Chapo's influence wasn't just a blip in the history of the U.S. drug war, it was a defining force, shaping the dynamics of the conflict for decades. His cartel's reach into every corner of American society, from streets to boardrooms, showed the power of organized crime in a world that often blurred the lines between legality and illegality. In the end, the drug war didn't end with his capture. It just became quieter, more fragmented, and more difficult to trace. El Chapo's rise to power was not without fierce opposition. Mexico's drug trade was a battlefield, with several powerful cartels vying for dominance. The Sinaloa cartel, under El Chapo's control, found itself constantly at odds with rivals like the Zetas, the Gulf Cartel, and the Knights Templar. Each of these cartels had their own territories, their own methods, and their own ambitions. As El Chapo worked to expand the Sinaloa cartel's reach, the violence that ensued was staggering. Shootouts, kidnappings, and brutal assassinations were commonplace as cartels fought for control over key routes and territories. One of the most notable rivalries was with the Zetas, a cartel known for its ruthlessness and militaristic approach to the drug trade. The Zetas were a formidable force, and their violent tactics, often involving mass killings and beheadings, struck fear into anyone who stood in their way. El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel, however, was no stranger to violence. His cartel responded with just as much ferocity, employing similar brutal tactics to maintain their position of power. The violence wasn't confined to Mexico alone. It spilled over into the U.S. as cartels fought to control drug distribution networks on both sides of the border. Throughout this period, El Chapo's strategic mind and ability to adapt to shifting power dynamics were critical. He forged alliances with other cartels when necessary, using diplomacy as much as violence to expand the Sinaloa cartel's reach. However, these alliances were often short-lived. In the world of Mexican cartels, loyalty was a fragile thing, and betrayal was a common currency. El Chapo's alliances shifted with the winds of power, and his ability to outmaneuver and outlast his enemies made him both a feared and respected figure. But these bloody turf wars didn't just affect rival cartels. They decimated entire communities, turning peaceful towns into war zones. The violence was so intense that entire regions became ungovernable. Local police and government officials, often corrupted or outgunned, could do little to stop the bloodshed. The collateral damage of these cartel wars was staggering. Innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of battles between rival drug lords. El Chapo's attempts to maintain dominance weren't just about taking down rivals. They also involved securing key routes into the United States. These smuggling routes were the lifeblood of his empire, and losing control over them could mean the downfall of everything he had worked for. Yet, his ability to adapt, whether through strategic alliances or through sheer force, allowed him to remain at the top. Despite the growing violence and the constant threat of betrayal, El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel was, for a time, unrivaled in its power and reach. But the constant wars, the unrelenting violence, and the toll it took on both his enemies and his allies would eventually leave scars that would mark the cartel and El Chapo for years to come. El Chapo's empire was far more than just a network of drug trafficking routes. It was a vast underground economy that reached deep into the fabric of both Mexican and American societies. In Mexico, his cartel's operations were intertwined with the lives of entire communities. Local economies depended on the illicit flow of drugs, and entire towns became dependent on the profits generated by El Chapo's empire. From low-level couriers to powerful politicians, everyone had their part to play. Drug cartels, led by men like El Chapo, were a significant part of the Mexican economy, and they provided jobs, albeit illegal ones. In an environment where traditional economic opportunities were limited, El Chapo's influence was felt in every corner of Mexican society. In the towns closest to the border, cartel money flowed freely. The Sinaloa cartel controlled everything from street-level drug sales to massive distribution networks that reached into the United States. But it wasn't just about the drug trade. El Chapo's cartel expanded into many other industries. Real estate, construction, and even legitimate businesses were often fronts for laundering the massive amounts of drug money generated by his operations. Local communities that might have otherwise suffered from economic instability found themselves, at least in the short term, benefiting from the influx of cash that the cartel brought with it. On the U.S. the side of the border, the underground economy was equally impacted. El Chapo's cartel was responsible for a massive share of the drugs that flooded into the U.S. His operations kept the streets of American cities supplied with cocaine, marijuana, heroin, and methamphetamine. But the impact wasn't just felt in the cities where the drugs were sold. The effects rippled throughout the economy. The cartels created an entire underground industry: money laundering, smuggling, arms dealing, and a host of other illegal activities that affected both the financial system and local law enforcement agencies. In many ways, the U.S. was just as tied to El Chapo's operations as Mexico. Drugs created billions of dollars in revenue that fueled a parallel economy, one that existed in the shadows, and one that was essential to the function of both countries. While the vast sums of money El Chapo generated contributed to local economies, they did so in a way that undermined real growth. Cartel money created a false economy, one that thrived on violence and exploitation. The long-term impact was devastating. Corruption flourished. Communities were torn apart by violence, and governments struggled to keep pace with the immense power that cartels like the Sinaloa cartel wielded. Local residents, often living in fear, became pawns in the game. Their livelihoods were controlled by forces outside their control, and their sense of security was constantly under threat. In the end, El Chapo's contribution to the underground economy was a double-edged sword. While it provided short-term wealth for some, it also sowed the seeds for widespread corruption and violence that would ripple through both Mexico and the U.S. for generations. His empire left a legacy that would be felt long after his fall from power, affecting everything from local communities to global economies. The Mexican government's response to El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel was marked by a relentless pursuit to dismantle one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. Law enforcement agencies at every level, local, state, and federal, were tasked with taking down the cartel. But the battle was far from straightforward. The cartels had deep roots in nearly every institution in Mexico, and the Sinaloa cartel, under El Chapo's leadership, was no exception. From the highest ranks of government officials to low-level police officers, corruption was rampant. The government's fight against the cartel was not only a war with the Sinaloa cartel itself, but also a battle against the web of internal betrayal that compromised law enforcement efforts. One of the primary challenges the government faced in combating El Chapo's cartel was the extent of the cartel's influence over local and federal officials. Many law enforcement officers were on the cartel's payroll, receiving bribes to turn a blind eye to the cartel's operations or even to directly aid in their smuggling efforts. From intercepting police raids to tipping off cartel members about upcoming arrests, corruption was a major factor in preventing effective law enforcement. The cartel's wealth and power allowed it to infiltrate the very institutions meant to stop it, ensuring its operations could continue uninterrupted. In some cases, government officials themselves were directly involved in aiding the cartel, facilitating drug shipments and providing protection to key cartel members. While the Mexican government did make significant efforts to confront the cartel, the level of corruption within its own ranks made it nearly impossible to sustain a successful long-term strategy. High-ranking officials, including some police officers, military personnel, and even politicians, were implicated in helping El Chapo's empire thrive. These betrayals weren't always blatant but occurred through small actions, leaked intelligence, fake arrests, or the release of cartel members who were meant to be detained. The cartel's ability to manipulate the system and turn law enforcement into their own personal allies was a testament to the immense power El Chapo and his associates held over the country. Even when the government managed to track down and arrest cartel members, the infiltration of the system meant that many were released or able to escape. El Chapo's first escape from prison in 2001 was a prime example of the weakness in the government system. The tunnel that allowed him to escape was constructed with the help of people inside the prison system, an indication that his reach extended even into the most secure locations. The government's response to the cartel's violence, corruption, and widespread control was slow and often hampered by this internal betrayal. Despite efforts by successive administrations to tackle the cartel's influence through military intervention, intelligence operations, and the capture of cartel leaders, the shadow of El Chapo's empire loomed large, and corruption within law enforcement often worked against these efforts. The task of dismantling the Sinaloa cartel was not just one of military might and intelligence, but of cleaning house within the very institutions charged with the fight. The government's battle against the cartel was as much a battle against itself as it was against the criminals it sought to eliminate. El Chapo's second capture in 2016 marked a turning point in his life on the run, but it also underscored the lengths to which he would go to reclaim his freedom. After being arrested in a high-profile operation, he was placed in one of Mexico's most secure prisons, the Altiplano Maximum Security Facility. The walls, the guards, the surveillance systems, everything was meant to hold him in place, to break his ability to continue leading the Sinaloa cartel. But El Chapo had already proven himself to be a master at evading capture, and this time he relied on an even more audacious plan. The prison where he was held was supposed to be impenetrable, a fortress designed to keep the most dangerous criminals locked away. Yet, in the world El Chapo inhabited, no fortress was impenetrable. His empire, built on smuggling and secrecy, had given him access to a network of people who could help execute even the most daring of plans. Just as before, it wasn't brute force or violence that would free him, but meticulous planning and ingenuity. This time, the escape would be even more elaborate. It involved an underground tunnel, not just any tunnel, but a tunnel that stretched over a mile long, going beneath the prison itself. The tunnel was equipped with ventilation, lighting, and even a motorcycle on rails that would carry him through the darkness to freedom. The construction of the tunnel was carried out by a team of engineers and cartel loyalists, working in secret, with only a few key people aware of the operation. The Mexican authorities were oblivious to the scale of the project until the moment El Chapo slipped through their fingers once again. The execution of the escape was as precise as it was dangerous. El Chapo, having grown accustomed to making his moves behind the scenes, knew exactly when to act. On July 11, 2015, while he was in his cell, the cartel's tunnel network finally connected to the prison's bathroom, where he made his way to the opening. The tunnel, which had been months in the making, was his way out. As he entered the darkness, the reality of his escape began to take form. On the other side of the tunnel, a motorcycle awaited him, and as he sped away, he once again disappeared into the Mexican landscape. Despite a nationwide manhunt, El Chapo's escape was so well planned that he evaded authorities for months. His escape from Altiplano became a global sensation, with news outlets around the world covering every detail of the operation. It was a humbling reminder of El Chapo's ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the immense power his cartel held. For a time, he was untouchable, once again slipping through the fingers of the Mexican government with little more than a tunnel and a motorcycle. The prison, once thought to be the ultimate cage for a criminal mastermind, had been outwitted. Yet, the escape wasn't just a personal victory, it was a statement. El Chapo wasn't just running from the law, he was a symbol of the cartel's dominance, a reminder that no walls, no matter how high, could contain him for long. El Chapo's influence extended far beyond the confines of the drug trade. His power reached deep into the political structures of both Mexico and the United States, allowing him to operate with a level of freedom few criminals can ever hope to achieve. Through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and carefully cultivated relationships, he built a network of connections that helped shield him from the law for decades. He was not just a drug lord, he was a political player, capable of bending officials to his will, manipulating systems of power, and ensuring his empire thrived under the radar. In Mexico, El Chapo's reach into politics was pervasive. He understood early on that no matter how much money he made, no matter how many tunnels he dug, he needed the protection of those in power to ensure his survival. Politicians, local officials, law enforcement, and even military figures were on his payroll. He used bribes to secure the loyalty of governors, mayors, and police chiefs, ensuring that his operations ran smoothly and without interference. The authorities, often corrupt and susceptible to his offers, turned a blind eye to the atrocities committed by his cartel, letting the violence and chaos flourish unchecked. His ties with politicians were not just about money. They were about mutual benefits. El Chapo gave them funding for their campaigns, support for their causes, and sometimes outright control over certain regions in exchange for their silence or direct assistance. This exchange of power made him untouchable for years. He was able to operate with impunity, knowing that even if the law came knocking, his political connections would buy him the time he needed to escape or suppress any investigation. In the United States, El Chapo's influence was just as profound, though his operations there were more covert. Through various intermediaries and his vast network of smuggling routes, he was able to make inroads with U.S. politicians, particularly those who could protect his interests at the border. His ability to move vast quantities of drugs without facing significant law enforcement opposition was aided by well-placed bribery and intimidation. Even as the U.S. government ramped up its efforts to bring him to justice, El Chapo continued to leverage his connections, ensuring that his operations remained undisturbed for as long as possible. Corruption became the tool of his trade. He didn't just bribe officials, he built relationships that were symbiotic in nature. He knew how to play the political game, offering the right people the right incentives to ensure his empire grew without fear of government intervention. This web of political influence kept him alive, in control, and continuously expanding his reach for years. The depth of his influence served as both a shield and a sword, allowing him to outsmart the authorities, manipulate the political system, and build one of the most powerful criminal empires the world had ever seen. In the end, it wasn't just his cartel that made him so dangerous. It was his ability to corrupt, influence, and control the very systems that were supposed to stop him. El Chapo's relationship with law enforcement was a complex dance, one where he was both the puppet master and the victim. In Mexico, He played the system like a seasoned strategist, cultivating deep ties with officials who were either bought off or simply too afraid to challenge him. His ability to operate with relative impunity was a testament to his deep pockets and his understanding of the power dynamics in the country. Bribery became his main weapon against law enforcement. From local police to high-ranking officials, El Chapo was known for paying handsomely to keep his operations running smoothly. The authorities knew of his cartel's violence, but many chose to turn a blind eye, driven by the allure of the bribes or the threat of retaliation. However, El Chapo's relationship with law enforcement wasn't just about money. He understood the importance of loyalty and favor. He created an environment where law enforcement officers were not just paid, but were kept in his pocket through a web of favors, promises, and fear. Police officers were tasked with securing routes for drug shipments, and military personnel were sometimes dispatched to ensure his safety during transport. Even when there were attempts to capture him, he had people on the inside who would warn him in advance. This network of informants within law enforcement became crucial to his survival. He knew who to trust, who was compromised, and who could be manipulated. When an officer or an official became too much of a threat, he didn't hesitate to neutralize them, ensuring that his operations remained intact. In the United States, El Chapo's dealings with law enforcement were no less strategic. His cartel was responsible for flooding U.S. streets with drugs, and while the DEA made him a prime target, he still managed to slip through their fingers time and time again. His ability to escape capture was in part due to his deep understanding of U.S. law enforcement tactics. He knew when to lay low, when to change up his routes, and most importantly, when to make alliances. He frequently turned to intermediaries who had connections with corrupt officials or had knowledge of law enforcement methods, using these links to stay one step ahead. Even when the noose tightened, El Chapo's network of bribes and strategic alliances allowed him to maintain an air of invincibility. He knew how to manipulate the legal system, sometimes by paying off lawyers to stall cases, or even using his cartel's influence to create political pressure on authorities to drop charges. As the authorities closed in, he relied on his ability to outsmart them, whether it was using his tunnels to escape prison or leveraging his vast influence to delay his capture. Ultimately, El Chapo's relationship with law enforcement, both in Mexico and the United States, was built on a delicate balance of fear, loyalty, and manipulation. The authorities were never far behind, but his ability to control the system allowed him to maintain his power for far longer than anyone ever expected. Even in his final days, as law enforcement finally caught up with him, the remnants of his network still worked to protect his legacy and the empire he had created. El Chapo's fortune was a product of both ingenuity and ruthless ambition. His cartel, one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world, generated unimaginable wealth from its operations. While the drugs flowed freely across borders, much of the money that came from the business was hidden beneath layers of complexity. El Chapo, known for his meticulous planning, made sure that his wealth was obscured from both authorities and the public eye. One of his most trusted strategies was money laundering, a necessary skill for anyone operating on the scale El Chapo had achieved. He utilized a variety of methods, many of which took advantage of the complex international financial systems that often turn a blind eye to illicit transactions. He made use of money exchange houses, legitimate businesses, and real estate investments, which helped him funnel his cartel's profits into seemingly legitimate channels. Through a network of trusted associates, including bankers and businessmen, El Chapo created a web of legal entities to hide the massive sums generated by his drug empire. His money was laundered through everything from fast food chains to construction companies, industries that were easily manipulated to look like they were making legitimate profits while, in reality, they were fronting for a multi-billion-dollar narcotics operation. But it wasn't just about hiding his money. El Chapo was known for living a life of opulence, a stark contrast to his relatively humble beginnings. His personal fortune allowed him to indulge in the finest luxuries, private jets, sprawling estates, and an array of vehicles that most could only dream of. He lived in some of the most luxurious properties, both in Mexico and abroad, building palatial homes that were equipped with everything from extravagant pools to private zoos. His estate at the infamous La Tuna was a fortress, complete with underground tunnels, high walls, and surveillance systems to protect his wealth and his life. It was a stark reflection of the kind of wealth he had amassed, wealth that made him untouchable for a time. Yet, for all of his luxury, El Chapo was careful about his public appearance. While he lived in opulence behind closed doors, he maintained a low profile when it came to showing off his wealth. His lifestyle was often hidden behind layers of false fronts, often blending into the background while simultaneously thriving on the profits of the illicit drug trade. The power that came with his money was one of control, but also of secrecy. He knew that exposure could bring unwanted attention, something he learned from his rise to power. Every decision, every move he made, had a reason, whether it was to protect his life or to protect his empire. Despite his careful planning, though, the money couldn't always stay hidden forever. As law enforcement caught up with him and the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo's wealth became one of the things that ultimately gave him away. It wasn't the lavish lifestyle or the properties that betrayed him, but the traces of money laundering that eventually drew the attention of both Mexican and U.S. authorities. In the end, even the wealth that had once been his greatest asset became his downfall. But for years, El Chapo's empire was built on a foundation of blood, wealth, and secrecy, leaving behind a legacy of money that few could ever dream of replicating. The Mexican government's war on drugs escalated as the power of the cartels grew, and El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel was at the forefront of this conflict. By the early 2000s, the government struggled to maintain control of its borders, cities, and regions that had fallen under cartel influence became more pronounced. The Mexican government, recognizing the devastating impact of drug-related violence on the country's stability, began to ramp up efforts to dismantle the cartels. The U.S. and government, heavily invested in curbing the flow of illegal drugs into its own country, supported these efforts, further intensifying the pressure on cartel leaders like El Chapo. El Chapo's role in the war on drugs was not passive. He was deeply involved in the violent and complex battle for control over key territories. The Sinaloa cartel, under his leadership, became the most powerful and sophisticated drug trafficking organization in Mexico. It wasn't just about moving narcotics. It was about controlling regions, winning alliances, and eliminating rivals. As the government cracked down harder, the violence escalated. Cartels fought back, using terror to maintain their grip on power. Shootouts in the streets became common, with innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. El Chapo, known for his tactical mind and ruthless efficiency, utilized both force and strategy to maintain his empire. The cartel's network of bribed officials, law enforcement officers, and military personnel allowed him to operate with a degree of impunity, further complicating the government's fight. As the war on drugs intensified, El Chapo's influence only grew. His ability to evade capture, coupled with his use of violence to eliminate threats, cemented his reputation as a criminal mastermind. He built alliances with other cartels, forming strategic partnerships that helped him secure his position as one of the most feared figures in the Mexican underworld. But with these alliances came betrayals, and El Chapo's violent efforts to keep his enemies in check led to bloodshed on a staggering scale. The government's counteroffensive had its successes, but each win was met with swift retaliation. The violence spread throughout Mexico, touching even the most remote corners of the country. For El Chapo, the war on drugs was as much a personal battle as it was a political and social one. It was about survival, control, and maintaining the dominance of his cartel. Despite numerous arrests, temporary imprisonments, and attempts on his life, he remained a central figure in the ongoing struggle for power. The government's efforts to break the cartel system were stifled by the sheer force of the cartel's reach and the corruption within the country's institutions. Even as the government enacted stricter policies and sent more military forces to combat the cartels, El Chapo adapted, always staying one step ahead. His role in the war on drugs was defined by his ability to navigate a system of brutality, loyalty, and violence, all while maintaining the facade of a man untouchable by the law. It was a war without clear lines, where the government and cartels alike continued to bleed Mexico dry. The final capture of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was the culmination of years of relentless pursuit, both by the Mexican government and international law enforcement. After his daring escape from a maximum security prison in 2015, the world knew that El Chapo would not be caught easily. The Sinaloa cartel leader, notorious for his cunning mind and ruthless methods, had once again slipped through the fingers of the authorities, but his freedom would be short-lived. The hunt for him intensified, and the world watched as law enforcement agencies across multiple countries coordinated efforts to bring him to justice. In the months that followed his escape, El Chapo went to ground, living in the shadows, moving constantly to avoid detection. He used all the resources at his disposal, employing a vast network of loyalists and corrupt officials to help him remain hidden. However, as the manhunt grew more determined, El Chapo's luck began to run out. The U.S. and Mexican authorities were not only hunting him, they were also sharing intelligence, coordinating operations that spanned continents. The cartel's operations started to show cracks as former associates turned informants, and his ability to control such a large empire from the shadows was increasingly compromised. It was a breakthrough in July 2016 that led to his eventual capture. After months of painstaking investigation, law enforcement tracked down a lead in the Mexican city of Los Mochis, Sinaloa. A team of Mexican Marines, working in conjunction with U.S. officials, raided a property where El Chapo was believed to be hiding. What followed was a chaotic firefight, the likes of which reflected the violence of El Chapo's reign. The confrontation ended with his arrest, but not before he narrowly escaped down one of his famously well-crafted tunnels, a symbol of his empire's ingenuity. Yet, this time, there was no escape. El Chapo was captured in a house, surrounded by a team of bodyguards and associates. His efforts to flee were thwarted, and as he was led away, his reputation as one of the most elusive and dangerous criminals in history had been definitively ended. For the Mexican government and the U.S., this was a significant victory. After over a decade of searching, with his capture came the promise of finally dismantling the Sinaloa cartel's vast network of violence and drugs. Yet, El Chapo's capture was more than just a law enforcement victory. It marked the end of an era in Mexico's ongoing war on drugs. The international effort to bring him down involved hundreds of agents, analysts, and countless hours of surveillance. For El Chapo, the end had come not with a blaze of glory, but with the inevitability of his empire's collapse. The final capture, though expected, was still a blow to his supporters and his myth. For the first time in many years, Joaquin Guzman was behind bars, his reign over the most powerful drug cartel in the world finally coming to an end. The trial of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was nothing short of a spectacle. After his capture in 2016, the drug lord was extradited to the United States, where he faced an array of charges that spanned across decades of criminal activity. From drug trafficking to money laundering to murder, the list of accusations was as long as his criminal career was notorious. His trial would not only decide his fate, but also become the focal point of a global media frenzy. As the world watched the fall of one of the most powerful and feared figures in the drug trade, the courtroom drama began in November 2018, with El Chapo seated in a secure cage, surrounded by guards. He appeared in a dark suit, his usual imposing demeanor replaced by the sharp focus of a man about to face his reckoning. Throughout the trial, the prosecution presented a damning case, with evidence that spanned years of Guzman's empire. His leadership of the Sinaloa cartel was dissected, with witnesses including former associates and cartel members testifying against him. Some of the testimonies were chilling, details of brutal murders, smuggling operations that stretched across borders, and the elaborate ways in which Guzman orchestrated his empire from prison and beyond. Many witnesses provided first-hand accounts of how El Chapo ran his business, his manipulations, and the sheer scale of violence used to keep his empire intact. One of the most talked-about aspects of the trial was the presence of his former mistresses and cartel insiders who testified in shocking detail about the inner workings of his operation. The courtroom became a stage where the dark, violent world of the Sinaloa cartel was laid bare for the public to see. But it wasn't just the prosecution's witnesses that kept the media captivated. El Chapo's defense team fought vigorously to discredit the testimonies, painting the case as a concerted effort by the U.S. government to destroy Guzman's reputation. They argued that many of the witnesses were unreliable or had their own motives for testifying. But the mounting evidence and the strength of the testimonies made it clear that El Chapo's days of evading the law were numbered. The trial was covered globally, with journalists, cameras, and reporters from around the world present to capture every moment. Each day brought new details of his empire's inner workings, from his use of tunnels to smuggle drugs to his extravagant lifestyle. The international media circus surrounding the trial turned it into one of the most watched courtroom events of the decade. Public interest was high, with people fascinated by the life of a man who had lived as a legend, a myth, and a kingpin of the underworld. In February 2019, after weeks of testimony, the jury found El Chapo guilty on all counts. The verdict was a formality, given the weight of the evidence. The trial was over, but the global spotlight on Guzman's rise and fall was far from finished. His legacy would live on in countless books, movies, and documentaries. Yet, for Joaquin Guzman, the court's decision was the final blow to a reign that had once seemed unshakable. His empire had crumbled, and now, as a convicted criminal, he would face the rest of his life behind bars. El Chapo's public persona was as carefully crafted as the empire he built. As the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, he was not only a figure of fear and violence, but also of myth and fascination. His image, portrayed through media coverage, became one of both admiration and horror, blending truth with sensationalism. The myths surrounding him transformed him from a drug lord into a legend. His name became synonymous with invincibility, escape, and the kind of power that transcended national borders. The media played a significant role in shaping the image of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. For years, he was an elusive figure, almost a ghost, whose empire seemed untouchable. The stories surrounding him, his daring escapes from prison, his ability to outwit law enforcement, and his ruthless hold over the drug trade fed into an image of a man who was both larger than life and unreachable. His ability to escape capture time and time again added to the aura of invulnerability that surrounded him. Journalists, filmmakers, and even pop culture were quick to immortalize him as a criminal mastermind. Books, documentaries, and films were made about him, further fueling the myth. For many, El Chapo wasn't just a criminal. He was a symbol of defiance, a man who fought against the system and refused to be brought down. The media's portrayal of El Chapo became increasingly sensationalized. While his criminal deeds were well documented, the media seemed to emphasize his larger-than-life qualities. Stories of his wealth, his luxurious lifestyle, and his dramatic escapes dominated headlines. He was often shown as a man of contradictions, a brutal killer who was also capable of immense charisma, a ruthless drug lord who built schools and hospitals in his community. This dichotomy only served to deepen his mystique. His public image became entwined with the idea that he was not merely a criminal, but a figure who had risen from the dust of his humble beginnings to challenge the very system that sought to crush him. The public's fascination with El Chapo also grew as the myth evolved. Many saw him as a Robin Hood-like figure, a man who used his power and resources to provide for his people, even as he inflicted terror on others. His infamous escape from a maximum security prison via a tunnel added to the folklore surrounding him. For some, he was the ultimate escape artist, a symbol of defiance against the state. For others, he was the epitome of evil, a man who destroyed lives and perpetuated violence on an unprecedented scale. But despite the myths, the truth remained stark. El Chapo was a criminal responsible for an untold number of deaths, whose empire caused untold suffering. His public persona, built on the media's portrayal and his own manipulations, masked the real damage he caused. As his trial unfolded and the world learned more about his crimes, the myth began to fade, revealing the true cost of the empire he had built. The legend of El Chapo, once untouchable, was shattered, leaving behind only the remnants of a man who had outlived his own story. After his capture and extradition to the United States, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's life entered a new, confined chapter. The man who had once controlled vast territories, smuggled massive quantities of drugs, and built tunnels to evade capture, now found himself in the cold, sterile confines of a U.S. maximum security prison. The walls that surrounded him were a far cry from the luxurious hideouts he once frequented. Yet even in captivity, the myth of El Chapo persisted. In the high-security facility where El Chapo was housed, he was kept in a solitary cell, isolated from the general population. It was a far cry from the freedom he once enjoyed as the leader of one of the world's most powerful drug cartels. But even within these tight restrictions, his influence didn't fade. While he was physically incarcerated, his network continued to function, albeit in a more discreet manner. He communicated with his former associates and cartel members through lawyers and messages passed along by trusted allies. His ability to direct operations from behind bars was a testament to the enduring loyalty of his followers and the extensive infrastructure he had built over the years. Despite being cut off from the outside world, El Chapo's presence loomed large in the prison system. His notoriety attracted the attention of other inmates, some of whom saw him as a figure to be revered. They knew his name, knew the empire he had built, and many respected him for his sheer audacity and cunning. Some inmates sought his approval, while others attempted to capitalize on his fame. El Chapo, however, remained a distant figure, controlling his interactions with those around him with calculated precision. The conditions in the U.S. prison system, especially for someone like El Chapo, were as harsh as they were isolating. He was subjected to strict protocols, including constant surveillance, limiting his communication with the outside world. His solitary confinement meant no contact with the general inmate population, and his every move was monitored. The very thing that made him a legend, his ability to evade capture and control vast criminal operations, was now reduced to the occasional fleeting conversation with his lawyers through glass partitions. But even in isolation, El Chapo's mind remained sharp, and his reputation, far from eroding, grew. His time in prison was also marked by an ongoing battle with the U.S. government. The authorities aimed to break his power, but El Chapo had outlasted countless manhunts and rival cartel forces. While he was imprisoned, his legacy continued to make waves. His capture, trial, and life behind bars became a source of fascination around the world. Even locked away in the confines of a prison cell, El Chapo remained an elusive and dangerous figure, his name still whispered in the dark corners of the criminal underworld, a reminder that no matter where he was, his empire lived on in the shadows. When Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was locked away in a U.S. maximum security prison, the future of the Sinaloa cartel seemed uncertain. The organization had been built around his leadership, his cunning, and his unparalleled ability to evade law enforcement. His absence left a massive void, and many wondered how the cartel would adapt without its most powerful figure. However, the cartel's survival was never in question. The Sinaloa cartel, like any powerful criminal organization, had deep roots, an extensive network, and the resources to maintain its operations, even in the face of its leader's imprisonment. The first few months after El Chapo's capture were marked by internal turmoil and uncertainty. His closest allies, many of whom had grown accustomed to his leadership, scrambled to maintain control of the cartel's sprawling operations. Power struggles broke out, as the various factions within the cartel fought to fill the vacuum left by El Chapo. Key figures, including his sons and trusted lieutenants, began jockeying for influence, each trying to assert their authority over the organization's vast empire. But the Sinaloa cartel was no stranger to conflict. Throughout its history, it had been a network of shifting allegiances, with various leaders and factions vying for power. The difference now was the leadership void at the top. In the absence of El Chapo, the cartel was forced to evolve and adapt. New leaders emerged, some with more ruthless strategies, others with a more subtle approach to power. Among them were his sons, who began to take on more prominent roles, and other high-ranking members who had once been subordinates. As these new leaders emerged, the cartel's operations began to shift. Some parts of the empire remained intact, while others evolved into more sophisticated, decentralized operations that were harder to track and disrupt. The cartel's ability to continue functioning without El Chapo was a testament to the network he had built. His leadership was not based solely on his charisma or personal presence, but on a well-oiled system that ran on loyalty, fear, and profit. His associates were fiercely loyal, and even without him at the helm, they continued to manage drug trafficking routes, money laundering operations, and smuggling rings. The cartel's vast network of corruption, from law enforcement officials to politicians, remained largely intact, providing the organization with the necessary protection to keep functioning. Despite the rise of new leaders, the power vacuum created by El Chapo's absence presented new challenges. Rival cartels, particularly the Jalisco New Generation cartel, began to push back against Sinaloa's dominance. Turf wars and violence erupted as different factions within and outside of the cartel competed for control of the lucrative drug routes. The Sinaloa cartel, though still formidable, was now engaged in an ongoing battle to maintain its position as the most powerful criminal organization in Mexico. Ultimately, while the cartel continued to operate after El Chapo's incarceration, the landscape had shifted, the leadership had changed, but the power struggles were far from over. As the world watched, the Sinaloa cartel's legacy was no longer just tied to El Chapo. It was being shaped by new leaders, new alliances, and an increasingly complicated web of violence and deceit that ensured its survival, albeit in a new form. After Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's capture, his myth only grew. Behind bars, he became larger than life, a symbol of power, defiance, and the underworld. His name, once feared in the darkest corners of the drug trade, now echoed in the public consciousness like a legend. People spoke of him in hushed tones, not just as a criminal, but as a figure whose audacity, resilience, and ruthlessness blurred the lines between reality and myth. His story, now seeping into pop culture, transcended the violence and greed that had defined his reign. El Chapo became a symbol of rebellion against the establishment, a man who had built an empire from the ground up and escaped the clutches of the law time and again. The media and pop culture seized on this myth, transforming it into something that felt both larger and darker than life itself. Netflix series, documentaries, books, and even songs were created to tell his story. They portrayed him as a mastermind, a man whose brain was as dangerous as his actions. The cartel, the escapes, the violence, these were just pieces of a much bigger story. El Chapo, in many ways, became a modern myth, his name synonymous with both genius and villainy. The allure of his personality, the image of a man who was both short in stature but a giant in influence, captivated the imagination of millions. In many ways, the myth of El Chapo was shaped by the very escape artistry that had defined his career. His daring escapes, particularly from the prison that was supposed to hold him for life, only fed into the narrative. He was no longer just a drug lord. He was a man who could outsmart the most powerful authorities in the world. His prison escapes, where he disappeared into tunnels beneath the earth, were as much a part of his legacy as the drugs he trafficked or the lives he destroyed. He had become a figure whose audacity was as celebrated as it was feared. But it wasn't just the media that gave him this larger-than-life status. His supporters, people who lived in the barrios he helped fund, people who viewed him as a protector, not a criminal, also played a crucial role in building his myth. To them, he was a modern-day Robin Hood, a man who, despite his violent ways, had provided opportunities and hope to communities abandoned by the government. The public perception of El Chapo was multifaceted, seen through the lens of both admiration and fear. In the years following his capture, the myth only grew. T-shirts with his face, graffiti on walls, even tattoos of his name became symbols of rebellion and defiance in certain parts of Mexico and beyond. He became a pop culture icon, a tragic hero to some, a villain to others. The myth of El Chapo had become immortal, a story of ambition, violence, and the impossible quest for power that would never fully be erased. His name is etched in the history of both the drug trade and modern folklore, forever a symbol of the power a single man can wield when the line between myth and reality becomes impossible to define. El Chapo's tunnels are more than just a testament to his cunning. They are the enduring symbol of his empire's resilience. Even after his arrest, the tunnels that helped him escape prison and smuggle drugs across borders continue to play a significant role in the drug trade. These underground passageways, crafted with ingenuity and precision, were more than just a way to move narcotics. They were part of a strategy that outsmarted the authorities for years. For El Chapo, the tunnels weren't merely tools. They were his weapon of choice in the war against law enforcement. The tunnels, which El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel mastered, connected various points between Mexico and the United States, often beneath the heavily fortified border. These were no ordinary dugouts. Each one was equipped with lighting, ventilation, and even rail systems to transport heavy loads of drugs swiftly and efficiently. The cartel had perfected the art of tunneling, creating an underground empire that not only allowed them to move vast quantities of cocaine, heroin, and marijuana, but also provided a sanctuary for El Chapo to evade capture. The tunnels became so sophisticated that even the most advanced surveillance systems couldn't detect them. After El Chapo's capture, law enforcement, both in Mexico and the United States, went on high alert, hoping to put an end to this subterranean network. However, despite efforts to destroy these tunnels, they remain active. New cartels have taken up the mantle, continuing to use the same infrastructure, capitalizing on the secrecy and effectiveness of the tunnels. The underground world that El Chapo helped create is still thriving, albeit under different leadership. As long as the demand for illicit drugs remains high, the tunnels will persist, continuing to provide a pathway for the illegal flow of drugs into the U.S. The legacy of El Chapo's tunnels is undeniable. They are more than just a part of his criminal empire. They represent the very essence of his ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and evade. Even in his absence, the tunnels continue to serve as a reminder of how far his reach truly was. His ingenious system of underground passageways has become a symbol of the lengths to which cartels will go to ensure their survival and dominance. The tunnels that El Chapo built may no longer be in his direct control, but their continued use is a testament to the enduring impact of his methods, a shadowy legacy that still haunts the drug trade today. El Chapo's legacy casts a long shadow, not only over the world of drug trafficking but also over the lives of his children. His rise to power and eventual capture did little to sever the ties between his family and the empire he built. Despite the chaos and violence that defined his reign, his children have found themselves inheriting a complicated and dangerous legacy, one that has placed them at the crossroads of power, wealth, and violence. The Guzman family, once a symbol of El Chapo's dominance, has become a point of contention and interest within the world of cartels. While the younger generation of El Chapo's children has not risen to the same level of notoriety as their father, they have certainly been entangled in the business. Some have openly flaunted their association with the cartel, while others have remained relatively quiet, knowing that the eyes of the world are always watching. As his sons, particularly, grow older, they face the burden of living up to the myth of their father, while simultaneously trying to distance themselves from the violent reality he created. Several of El Chapo's sons have been linked to the Sinaloa cartel's operations, with some believed to be involved in the inner workings of the organization. Their roles, however, are often unclear. While some have been arrested, others remain free, moving in and out of the public eye. In the wake of their father's arrest, the cartel has continued to thrive, partly due to the efforts of El Chapo's sons, who seem to be positioning themselves as successors to the empire. However, it's a fragile line they walk, trying to assert control without making themselves targets. The cartel world is filled with power struggles, betrayals, and shifting alliances, and the Guzman children, like any other heirs, face the threat of being overtaken by rivals. El Chapo's children also have to navigate the public perception of their father's legacy. The media and law enforcement continue to paint him as one of the most ruthless and cunning figures in criminal history, and his children are often seen through the same lens. The Guzman name carries weight both in terms of power and infamy, and for the younger Guzmans, it's a legacy they can't easily escape, whether they choose to embrace it or reject it. The ghost of El Chapo is a constant presence in their lives. Despite this, there are moments where the children of El Chapo have attempted to distance themselves from the cartel world. Some have sought to live quieter lives, perhaps with the hope of avoiding the bloodshed that defined their father's reign. Yet the lure of power and money remains strong. The decisions they make, whether to follow in their father's footsteps or to carve out a new path, will inevitably be shaped by the lessons they've learned, both from their father's rise and his fall. In the end, the legacy of El Chapo is not just a matter of wealth or power, but one of survival. His children are left to contend with the expectations of a world that still regards their father as a legend, all while trying to escape the violent grip of the cartel world that defined his life. The Sinaloa cartel, under El Chapo's leadership, wielded an economic power that stretched far beyond the borders of Mexico. It was a force that touched the global drug trade, turning the cartel into a multi-billion-dollar empire. The scale of its operations was staggering, with profits that rivaled those of legitimate international corporations. El Chapo's empire wasn't just a network of illicit drug trafficking. It was an economic machine that operated with a level of precision and ruthlessness that allowed it to thrive in a world where many smaller players failed. At its height, the Sinaloa cartel was responsible for the distribution of a significant percentage of the drugs that flooded the streets of the United States and beyond. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, These were the products that fed not only the addiction of millions, but also the financial system of the cartel. Each shipment carried not just drugs, but vast amounts of money, laundered through a series of front companies and international banking networks designed to conceal the true scope of its operations. The cartel's ability to control the flow of drugs into the U.S. gave it a near monopoly on certain markets, creating vast amounts of wealth, much of it flowing directly into El Chapo's coffers. El Chapo's financial influence wasn't confined to just drug money. The wealth the cartel generated allowed it to infiltrate legitimate industries and gain access to powerful networks of influence, both in Mexico and abroad. With his vast financial resources, El Chapo was able to buy loyalty, ensuring that law enforcement, politicians, and businessmen alike remained under his control. His ability to bribe officials was well known, and the massive sums of money at his disposal made it almost impossible for authorities to keep up with his empire. The impact of El Chapo's wealth on the international drug trade cannot be overstated. It was not simply about moving drugs. It was about creating a system that allowed the cartel to remain untouchable for so long. His wealth was a tool for survival and expansion, giving the cartel the ability to diversify its operations and protect its interests. Whether through the use of private jets to move drugs, or the purchase of land, weapons, and technology to further strengthen the cartel's grip on its territories, El Chapo's financial power enabled him to expand the cartel's reach far and wide. His financial empire also had a ripple effect on the global drug trade. Other cartels and criminal organizations, inspired by the success of the Sinaloa cartel, sought to replicate its methods, creating a new model for the drug industry that emphasized international collaboration and strategic, large-scale operations. The wealth El Chapo amassed fueled not only the cartel's operations, but also the networks of corruption and violence that it left in its wake, influencing the way drugs moved, sold, and were consumed on a global scale. Through money, El Chapo was able to protect himself and the Sinaloa cartel for years. But, as history shows, even the mightiest empires eventually fall, and El Chapo's immense wealth was no safeguard against the eventual crackdown on his cartel. Nevertheless, the financial legacy of the Sinaloa cartel remains a defining feature of the international drug trade, and its influence continues to be felt long after El Chapo's capture. El Chapo's story transcended the criminal underworld, evolving into a cultural phenomenon that captured the public's imagination across the globe. His rise and fall, filled with drama, violence, and escape, made for a narrative so compelling that it became fodder for numerous TV shows, movies, and documentaries. His life was an open book to some, and a legend to others, and the media, always in search of a captivating story, was quick to immortalize him as a figure larger than life. The portrayal of El Chapo on screen echoed the fascination many had with his persona, part criminal mastermind, part folk hero, part myth. One of the most significant portrayals came through the hit TV series Narcos, Mexico, where El Chapo was depicted as a cunning and ruthless drug lord, a man whose ambition and intelligence made him a formidable force in the drug trade. The show, though fictionalized for dramatic effect, captivated viewers with its gritty portrayal of the drug wars in Mexico and El Chapo's calculated rise within the Sinaloa cartel. His character, brilliantly portrayed, showcased the delicate balance he maintained between being a ruthless kingpin and a family man, traits that only added layers to his public image, blurring the lines between villain and anti-hero. Documentaries, too, have played a crucial role in shaping the narrative of El Chapo, presenting a more factual, if sensationalized, account of his life. These productions often focused on his dramatic escapes, the unprecedented manhunt to capture him, and the ongoing battle between law enforcement and drug cartels. His story became a centerpiece in the broader conversation about the war on drugs, corruption, and the power dynamics that allowed someone like him to exist for so long at the top of the criminal world. Documentaries like El Chapo, The Kingpin of Crime, and The Life and Crimes of El Chapo explored his personal life and criminal empire, but they also cast a wider net, tackling the political and economic environments that allowed cartels to flourish in Mexico and beyond. El Chapo's influence in pop culture was also evident in music, where he became a symbol for those drawn to the mystique of the drug trade. Songs referencing his name and life, often in a glorified light, became anthems in certain communities. His name became synonymous with power, survival, and rebellion, qualities that appealed to a youth culture that admired the idea of breaking societal norms and building empires, no matter the cost. But the fascination with El Chapo wasn't limited to Hollywood or music. He became a subject of memes, internet culture, and urban legend. His image, often shown as a man of modest stature, yet immense power, was plastered across t-shirts, posters, and graffiti. The contrast between his humble beginnings and the empire he built intrigued many, creating a complex figure who could be both villain and symbol of resistance in the eyes of the public. Ultimately, El Chapo's portrayal in pop culture reflects more than just the fascination with a notorious criminal. It reveals the allure of a man who, despite his flaws and crimes, managed to become an icon, a symbol of the darker side of ambition, the complexity of power, and the price of legacy. His story continues to be told, retold, and mythologized, ensuring that his influence on pop culture remains undeniable long after his capture. As El Chapo's empire expanded, so did the layers of protection he built around himself. His growing paranoia became a defining feature of his life, and it was this paranoia that drove many of his decisions. For someone who had risen to the pinnacle of the drug trade, El Chapo knew that the higher you climb, the more dangerous the fall. And as the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, every move he made could attract the attention of law enforcement, rival cartels, or even those within his own ranks looking to take his place. It was this constant threat that shaped his world, where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, and betrayal was always lurking just around the corner. El Chapo's strategy for survival was rooted in secrecy and deception. He created a fortress of lies and layers of security that made it nearly impossible for anyone to find him, let alone take him down. He employed a network of loyalists who operated in complete silence, and his communications were always encrypted or passed through third parties. It became almost a game of cat and mouse, with law enforcement constantly trying to outwit him while he stayed 3 steps ahead. He would never stay in one place too long, constantly moving between safe houses and compounds, and even when he did find himself in a seemingly secure location, he was always preparing for the next escape. His paranoia extended to his relationships as well. Even his closest associates were subjected to his suspicion. El Chapo would often test their loyalty, feeding them false information to see who would leak it. Anyone who was deemed untrustworthy was swiftly removed from the equation, sometimes violently. Even within the cartel, the lines between allies and enemies became blurred as trust dissolved and survival instincts kicked in. But it wasn't just people he feared. It was the very systems that governed society. El Chapo's escape from his first prison was the perfect embodiment of his paranoia. He meticulously planned every detail, ensuring that there were no loose ends, and even built a tunnel under his cell as a failsafe. His second prison break was no different. He turned his maximum security cell into another, carefully constructed hideout, complete with the tunnel that would eventually lead to his escape. His ability to outsmart the authorities was a testament to how far he would go to maintain control and avoid capture. The walls he built were not just physical, they were mental, constructed from years of calculating every move and anticipating every possible threat. The legacy of his paranoia is evident in the cartel's operations. 2. El Chapo's reign relied heavily on his ability to keep everything under wraps. The Sinaloa cartel functioned with a level of secrecy that allowed it to thrive in the shadows. But as the years passed, even he couldn't outrun the inevitable. His methods, once foolproof, began to unravel as technology and global law enforcement networks grew more advanced. Yet, the lengths he went to protect himself and his empire remain a testament to the fear that drove him. It was not just about surviving, it was about outlasting everyone else, becoming a shadow in a world of threats. The Sinaloa cartel's battle with the Mexican government was a brutal, unrelenting conflict that shaped the landscape of the country for years. From the moment El Chapo rose to power, his cartel became a force to be reckoned with, and the Mexican government, determined to dismantle the cartels, found itself locked in a violent struggle that would escalate to unimaginable levels. This war wasn't fought solely on the streets. It was waged through corruption, intimidation, and a seemingly endless cycle of violence that left both sides scarred. At its core, the cartel's war with the government was a battle for control of the drug trade, control of the streets, control of the economy. For the government, it was about restoring order, enforcing the law, and proving that the state had the power to take down its most powerful criminals. For the Sinaloa cartel, it was a matter of survival. El Chapo and his associates understood that every attack on the government was a step toward maintaining their empire, while every blow they took from law enforcement was a reminder of the fragile nature of their power. The government's attempts to crush the cartel were met with equally ruthless retaliation, and the result was a cycle of violence that would leave thousands dead and the country in a state of constant turmoil. The violence that ensued was both extreme and relentless. Cartel members, armed with advanced weaponry and operating in tight-knit cells, launched attacks on police, military officials, and government buildings. In turn, the government responded with military force, sending in federal troops to tackle the growing threat. The streets became battlegrounds, with innocent civilians often caught in the crossfire. Shootouts between cartel gunmen and law enforcement were common, and entire neighborhoods were taken over by cartel factions, making them no-go zones for the authorities. The conflict was a daily reality for many Mexicans, especially those in cartel-controlled territories. What made this war even more dangerous was the corruption that fueled it. Law enforcement officers, military personnel, and even politicians were often on the cartel's payroll. Bribery was the currency of the day, and it allowed the Sinaloa cartel to operate with impunity for years. El Chapo's ability to infiltrate the government and pay off key figures within the system meant that even when the government launched major operations against the cartel, it was often undermined by internal betrayal. The government's inability to combat the cartel effectively only fueled the cartel's power, creating a vicious cycle where both sides were locked in a game of cat and mouse, but the rules were constantly changing. The cartel's war with the government became a symbol of the broader issues plaguing Mexico, an economy struggling under the weight of the drug trade, a government compromised by corruption, and a country where violence and fear were everyday realities. Despite the efforts of the government, the Sinaloa cartel continued to thrive, with El Chapo at the helm, making the war a long, drawn-out battle for control that would shape Mexico's future in ways that are still felt today. The capture of El Chapo in 2016 marked a turning point for the Sinaloa cartel. Once the most dominant drug trafficking organization in the world, its power and reach began to diminish rapidly in the aftermath of his arrest. El Chapo had been the heart and soul of the cartel, a figure who managed not only to keep it intact, but to expand its operations across borders, making it an indomitable force. Without him, the cartel began to show signs of strain, fractured by internal divisions and external pressures. At the time of his arrest, the Sinaloa cartel controlled vast networks stretching across the globe, from Mexico to the United States, Central and South America, and even into Europe and Asia. However, with El Chapo behind bars, Many of the key figures who had operated under his leadership began to vie for power, creating factions within the organization. The once united force splintered as different members sought to carve out their own territories, leading to infighting and disarray within the cartel's ranks. The leadership vacuum left by El Chapo's absence made the cartel vulnerable to challenges from other criminal groups, both old and new. The fall of El Chapo was also a signal to rival cartels that the Sinaloa cartel's grip on the drug trade was loosening. Other criminal organizations, such as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, began to rise in prominence. The CJNG, in particular, capitalized on the weakened state of Sinaloa by expanding its operations and seizing territories once dominated by El Chapo's network. With El Chapo imprisoned and the leadership of Sinaloa fractured, these rival cartels started to fill the void left behind, escalating the violence in Mexico as they battled for control. In addition to the CJNG, other smaller organizations and independent traffickers saw an opportunity to gain influence in the wake of Sinaloa's decline. The fragmentation of the Sinaloa cartel opened up space for these groups to make their own moves, resulting in a more chaotic and dangerous environment. While the cartel's operations were still expansive, the lack of a unified leadership meant that it could no longer function with the same efficiency and coordination it once had under El Chapo's rule. The cartel's once seamless operations were now marred by constant internal conflicts, competition from other criminal organizations, and pressure from law enforcement agencies both in Mexico and the United States. Despite its weakened state, the Sinaloa cartel continued to operate, though its influence had undeniably waned. The loss of El Chapo and the fragmentation of the organization signaled a shift in Mexico's drug war, with new players emerging to challenge the old order. The rise of rival cartels, coupled with the growing influence of smaller, decentralized networks, meant that the landscape of the drug trade was changing, no longer dominated by the Sinaloa cartel, but by a variety of powerful, ruthless groups vying for control. El Chapo's arrest marked the end of an era for Sinaloa, but the war for control of Mexico's drug trade was far from over. El Chapo's myth continues to resonate long after his capture, remaining an indelible part of popular culture and the collective imagination. His story is one of audacity, cunning, and sheer defiance of authority, and these qualities have elevated him to near legendary status. Despite being imprisoned, his name has become synonymous with the underworld, representing not just a cartel leader, but a symbol of resistance against an unyielding system. The mystique surrounding him is fueled by the almost cinematic nature of his life, his ability to repeatedly evade capture, and the larger-than-life persona he crafted. Part of the power of El Chapo's myth is tied to his incredible escapes, particularly the escape from prison that is still talked about in awe. The tunnels, the planning, the precision, his ability to vanish without a trace, despite being one of the most wanted men in the world, only deepened his legend. For many, he was more than a drug lord. He was a master tactician, a figure who outwitted the most sophisticated forces trying to bring him down. It was this constant outmaneuvering of authorities that created a mystique of invincibility, a belief that El Chapo was untouchable, that even the most powerful institutions couldn't cage him. The image of a man living in luxurious safe houses, evading the law with a smile, played right into the myth of him being both a mastermind and a folk hero for those who viewed him as a champion of the oppressed. His escape from justice for so long only contributed to this myth. The stories of his cunning, resourcefulness, and the sheer audacity of his escape plans turned him into a folk legend. His face, his name, and his legend were everywhere on t-shirts, in documentaries, in Netflix series, and in music lyrics. His image was never just that of a criminal. It became emblematic of defiance, of someone who fought back against the establishment, even if that fight came at the cost of thousands of lives. El Chapo became a modern anti-hero, someone who evaded justice time and again, but whose power seemed to only grow as a result. Even now, as he sits in a maximum security U.S. prison, El Chapo's story continues to inspire and captivate. His myth is bigger than the man himself, extending far beyond his criminal empire and into the realm of popular culture, where it is retold in countless forms. The fascination with El Chapo is not just about his wealth or his drug empire, but about the deeper narrative of his ability to elude, capture, and defy the odds. For some, his story is a modern myth, a testament to power, resilience, and rebellion against a system that seemed to have no answer for him. His legacy lives on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts and minds of those who still see him as a symbol of something far greater than himself. El Chapo's impact on the music world is perhaps most clearly seen through the narco corrido, a genre of music that tells stories about the drug trade, often glamorizing the lives of infamous drug lords like him. Narco corridos, originally born out of Mexico's northern regions, have evolved into a cultural phenomenon, with many songs dedicated to the exploits of drug traffickers. These songs serve as both a form of storytelling and an expression of defiance, capturing the power, danger, and allure of the cartel world. El Chapo's story, with its highs and lows, has made him a central figure in this musical genre. His legendary escapes, his command over the Sinaloa cartel, and his larger-than-life persona have been immortalized in dozens of narco corridos. These songs paint him as a heroic figure, a man who rose from humble beginnings to become a kingpin, outsmarting both law enforcement and rival cartels with a mix of charm, cunning, and ruthlessness. His persona is presented in the music as a champion of the oppressed, a figure who defied the system and lived by his own rules. The glorification of his life in narco corridos has caused much debate. For many, these songs are simply an expression of the culture that surrounds the drug trade, celebrating its rebellious spirit and outlaw characters. The narco corrido genre, after all, is not new. It has a long history of celebrating figures who live on the edge of society, from revolutionaries to criminals. But for others, the celebration of men like El Chapo through music represents a dangerous idealization of violence and crime, feeding into a cycle of glorification that could encourage the younger generations to idolize drug lords instead of seeing the real consequences of their actions. Nevertheless, El Chapo's influence on the narco corrido world is undeniable. The impact of his image on the genre goes beyond just a few songs. His life, or at least the version of it portrayed in these tunes, has become a mythic narrative, an almost folk-like tale that blends fact and fiction. The music captures not only his criminal success, but the image of the man himself, untouchable, indomitable, and always a step ahead of the authorities. For many, these songs provide an escape, a way to fantasize about power and control in a world that often feels beyond reach. Narco corridos featuring El Chapo continue to gain traction, even after his capture. They carry his legacy forward, embedding him into the cultural fabric of Mexico and the U.S., especially among those who romanticize the drug world. As a result, his story lives on not just in courtrooms or prison cells, but in the verses of these songs that continue to be sung in cities, towns, and homes across the globe. El Chapo's prison breaks became some of the most talked about events in the history of the drug trade. The audacity and precision behind his escapes were a testament to his strategic brilliance, but they also underscored his ability to remain a step ahead of both law enforcement and his rivals. Each escape was not just a physical getaway. They were meticulously planned operations that reinforced his reputation as an untouchable figure. His ability to escape from some of the most secure prisons in Mexico was a feat of ingenuity, one that would inspire awe and fear across the world. The first escape, in 2001, was the stuff of legend. After being arrested and incarcerated in a maximum security prison, El Chapo managed to pull off a plan that would make any criminal mastermind envious. He was smuggled out in a laundry cart, a simple but effective method. From there, he was whisked away to freedom through a carefully concealed tunnel that led to an underground network. This escape set the stage for his continued dominance in the cartel world, proving to both his allies and enemies that he was not someone to be contained. His second escape, in 2015, was even more daring. This time, El Chapo didn't rely on something as simple as a laundry cart. He orchestrated a breakout from the Altiplano prison, one of Mexico's most secure facilities. The escape was facilitated by a tunnel that had been dug specifically for the purpose of freeing him. This tunnel, complete with lighting and ventilation, stretched nearly a mile and emerged in a house several miles away. His escape was so well planned that it took the authorities days to even realize he was gone. This second break solidified El Chapo's status as a criminal legend, and it was a blow to the Mexican government's fight against the drug cartels. These escapes did more than just free El Chapo. They sent shockwaves through the drug trade. The fact that he was able to break out not once, but twice, raised questions about the effectiveness of the prison system and the ability of the Mexican government to contain him. For El Chapo's enemies, it was a reminder of his resilience and cunning. For his allies, it was a reaffirmation of his dominance in the cartel world. Each break shifted the power dynamics, forcing law enforcement to focus even more resources on capturing him, while the cartels strengthened their grip on key territories in the wake of his escape. El Chapo's prison breaks became symbolic of his entire career. They were not just physical escapes. They were a representation of his ability to manipulate systems, evade justice, and maintain control over his empire despite the odds stacked against him. These legendary escapes also became part of the mythos surrounding him, proof that he was untouchable. Even when trapped behind bars, his ability to break free from prison solidified his status as one of the most notorious and influential figures in the history of the drug trade. The hunt for El Chapo was one of the most intense and far-reaching manhunts in modern history, a sprawling international effort that saw the collaboration of both U.S. and Mexican authorities. After his second escape from prison in 2015, El Chapo's legend only grew, as did the urgency to bring him to justice. The U.S. government, alongside Mexican law enforcement, mounted a full-scale operation to capture the man who had evaded capture for so long. The stakes were higher than ever before, not just because of El Chapo's prominence as the head of the Sinaloa cartel, but also due to the embarrassment his escape caused to both countries. The task of tracking him down was nothing short of monumental. Authorities knew that El Chapo, ever the strategist, would have taken extreme precautions to avoid capture. The U.S. government, eager to bring him to trial in the U.S., offered millions in rewards for tips leading to his capture. Simultaneously, Mexican authorities used a combination of their own intelligence networks and U.S. technology, including drones and satellite surveillance, to monitor suspected hideouts. The effort was massive, but El Chapo was elusive, hiding in safe houses in rural areas, often relying on underground tunnels and a network of loyalists to evade detection. U.S. agents worked alongside their Mexican counterparts, combining resources and information. They shared intelligence about known associates, cartel leaders, and safe houses, working in lockstep. Even though their cooperation had often been strained due to the history of cartel corruption within Mexican law enforcement, the political tension surrounding the pursuit was palpable. El Chapo was not only a criminal, but a symbol of the ongoing war between the U.S. and Mexican drug cartels. For years, he had operated with near impunity, slipping through the cracks of both countries' law enforcement systems. Despite his efforts to remain hidden, El Chapo's growing paranoia eventually led to his downfall. The search for him stretched across the U.S. and Mexico's rugged terrain into urban centers and remote mountains. The authorities traced every lead, checking in with informants who had once worked for him, and combing through the vast network of connections that El Chapo had spent decades building. The hunt was grueling, with setbacks and false starts, but the combined effort eventually led to his capture in January 2016. El Chapo was tracked down in a carefully coordinated raid in Los Mochis, a city in northern Mexico. Despite his many escape plans and underground networks, he was found in a house with his bodyguards and some of his inner circle. The operation was executed flawlessly, with no casualties on the law enforcement side. After months of painstaking work and countless hours of surveillance, the man who had outsmarted authorities for decades was finally back in custody. His capture marked the end of one chapter in the global war on drugs, but it also left a lasting mark on international law enforcement. The hunt for El Chapo was a testament to the power of cooperation between nations and a reminder of how the reach of the drug trade extends far beyond borders. The final years of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman were marked by isolation, yet his influence never truly diminished, even behind the high walls of a U.S. maximum security prison. After his capture and subsequent extradition to the United States in 2017, El Chapo was placed in solitary confinement, far removed from the world he had once controlled. His physical freedom had been stripped away, but the myth surrounding him and his reach in the underworld remained strong. In prison, he was locked in a tiny cell, devoid of the luxuries he had once enjoyed. His every movement was monitored, and the U.S. government took every precaution to ensure he wouldn't escape again. Yet, even in confinement, El Chapo's legend lived on. His ability to orchestrate operations from behind bars was nothing short of remarkable. Despite being incarcerated in the infamous ADX Florence, often referred to as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, where inmates are kept in near total isolation, El Chapo's criminal empire didn't stop. The Sinaloa cartel continued to operate, with new leaders rising to power, but his presence was still felt at the top. Reports surfaced of cartel members seeking his counsel through coded messages passed along by his attorneys, or through whispers among his trusted associates, who still roamed free on the streets. El Chapo's influence transcended his physical boundaries. His connections in Mexico and the U.S. remained potent, and his name was still a powerful currency in the world of narco-trafficking. Though he couldn't command the cartel with the same hands-on approach as before, his leadership remained a cornerstone for those loyal to him. The violence, corruption, and money that defined his reign continued to ripple through the criminal underworld. Even from behind bars, his decisions affected major drug routes, shipments, and illicit dealings. The final chapter of El Chapo's life was ultimately defined by his trial and conviction in 2019. He was found guilty of multiple charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and involvement in organized crime. The trial, a media spectacle in its own right, gave the world a glimpse into the inner workings of his empire, exposing the brutality, greed, and power that El Chapo had amassed. Yet, as the legal process moved forward, there was an undeniable sense that his story, like that of many infamous figures, was far from over. The public continued to romanticize his life, casting him as both a ruthless criminal and a tragic anti-hero. His narrative became as much about myth as it was about reality. As El Chapo spent his final years confined to his cell, he was left to reflect on the empire he built and the impact he had on a world that was now far removed from the one he once ruled. His legacy, though tarnished by his crimes, had shaped the very fabric of modern drug culture, leaving behind a haunting question of whether his influence would ever truly fade. Even in his final days, El Chapo remained a figure of fascination, his story continuing to captivate the world long after he was locked away. After Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was arrested and extradited to the United States, his family found themselves thrust into a new reality, one marked by danger, uncertainty, and the weight of his notorious legacy. For years, they had enjoyed the privileges of his power, wealth, protection, and influence, but now, they were forced to navigate a world where their last name carried a different meaning. It wasn't just about surviving the physical dangers, it was about surviving the constant scrutiny and the emotional toll of being associated with one of the most infamous criminals in history. El Chapo's wife, Emma Coronel, became the public face of his family after his arrest. A former beauty queen and the mother of his twin daughters, Emma had been married to El Chapo for years before his capture. She tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for her children, while also managing the overwhelming pressure that came with being linked to a cartel kingpin. She faced public mockery, constant media attention, and the stigma of her husband's crimes. Despite her efforts to distance herself from the cartel's operations, it was nearly impossible for her to escape the shadow of his legacy. The couple's daughters were also thrust into a life that they never asked for, a life filled with fear and uncertainty. As El Chapo's empire crumbled, the family's once luxurious lifestyle was replaced with constant threats and surveillance. They had to move frequently, relying on aliases and secret locations to avoid detection. In some ways, they were prisoners of the myth that El Chapo had created, a myth that had grown so large that it seemed to follow them wherever they went. The pressure on them was immense, from both law enforcement and the public. Their father's story became a global obsession, and every move they made was dissected by the media. Despite the challenges, El Chapo's children tried to live relatively normal lives, but the realities of their father's legacy were always present. His sons, particularly, were rumored to have involvement in the cartel's ongoing operations, though the details were murky. They were expected to carry on their father's name and, perhaps, continue his work. However, the cartel had fractured, and with their father behind bars, it was unclear whether they would be able to command the same loyalty or respect that El Chapo once did. The family's struggles were compounded by the constant threat of violence from rival cartels and the government. El Chapo's enemies were eager to strike at his family in a bid to further dismantle his empire, and authorities saw the family as a potential threat to their long-term efforts to eliminate the cartel. As a result, many of El Chapo's relatives had to go into hiding, living under assumed identities to protect themselves from harm. Ultimately, El Chapo's family's survival was about more than just evading danger. It was about trying to rebuild lives shattered by the monstrous legacy of a man who had shaped the drug trade for decades. The pressure of being the offspring of a cartel kingpin is something that no amount of money or power could ever protect them from, and it is a burden that would follow them for the rest of their lives. El Chapo's relationship with the U.S. government was one marked by constant cat-and-mouse games, tension, and relentless pursuit. His Sinaloa cartel became one of the most formidable forces in the global drug trade, and, as its leader, El Chapo was a direct target for U.S. law enforcement agencies, including the DEA and FBI. For years, he and his empire operated with near impunity, using sophisticated methods to smuggle massive amounts of drugs into the United States. The U.S. government knew that dismantling the Sinaloa cartel was essential not only to combating the flow of narcotics, but also to stifling the violent forces that were wreaking havoc across both sides of the border. The complexity of this relationship stemmed from the sheer scale of the cartel's operations and its ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. El Chapo's operations were carefully planned and executed, with layers of protection both legal and illegal that made it difficult for U.S. authorities to pinpoint his exact whereabouts. His tunnels, a hallmark of his ingenuity, allowed drugs to be smuggled with ease, evading detection by both U.S. and Mexican officials. The cartel controlled key trafficking routes, with El Chapo orchestrating shipments from South America to the U.S., using an extensive network of couriers, hidden compartments, and bribes to facilitate the process. For U.S. officials, capturing El Chapo became a high priority. The cartel's influence reached across the U.S., with the drug trade fueling addiction and violence in cities from Los Angeles to Chicago. El Chapo's ability to evade capture only added to his myth, making him even more dangerous and elusive. He became an almost mythical figure within the U.S. law enforcement world. Representing everything, authorities were fighting against unfathomable wealth, overwhelming power, and a brazen disregard for the law. The U.S. government responded with all the tools at its disposal. They worked closely with Mexican authorities, forging an uneasy alliance to combat the cartel's reach. U.S. law enforcement agencies launched numerous operations to infiltrate the cartel, employing wiretaps, surveillance, and informants to track El Chapo's movements. Yet, the cartel's web of corruption and bribery extended deep within Mexico's political system, making it difficult to root out the influence that protected El Chapo. Many of his associates, including law enforcement officers and politicians, were on the cartel's payroll, making the fight even more uphill. The relationship turned into an all-out war after El Chapo's dramatic escapes from prison, which only further entrenched the U.S. government's determination to bring him to justice. His second escape from a maximum security prison in 2015, aided by a tunnel that reached into the heart of the facility, embarrassed both the Mexican and U.S. governments and prompted an intensified global manhunt. Eventually, El Chapo was recaptured in 2016 and extradited to the U.S. to face trial. For the U.S. government, this marked the culmination of years of painstaking efforts to dismantle the Sinaloa cartel. The trial was a showcase of the cartel's reach, exposing the inner workings of a criminal empire that had operated with impunity for decades. Despite his imprisonment, El Chapo's influence continued to loom large, reminding both the U.S. and Mexico of the extraordinary lengths required to confront such a force. The end of El Chapo's reign marked not only the downfall of a drug lord, but also the unraveling of one of the most sophisticated criminal networks the world had ever known. For decades, his empire had thrived under the radar, its operations vast and intricate, relying on an army of loyalists, secretive routes, and an ironclad system of corruption. But with his capture, and ultimately his trial, the system that had once been nearly impenetrable began to collapse piece by piece. His arrest in 2016 signaled the beginning of the end for the Sinaloa cartel's unchallenged dominance in the global drug trade. Yet, even as El Chapo was behind bars, the legacy of his cartel continued to cast a long shadow. The Sinaloa cartel, though severely weakened, did not vanish overnight. The transition of power within the organization was a process marked by infighting, betrayal, and the rise of new leaders vying for control. El Chapo's sons, particularly, began to stake their claim in the cartel's future, but they were met with resistance from both within and outside the family. The cartel's ability to operate on such a global scale made it difficult to eradicate fully, even with El Chapo's capture. While law enforcement efforts increased after El Chapo's arrest, the lasting effects of his criminal network could still be felt. The cartel had embedded itself deeply within the fabric of Mexico's underworld, with ties to politicians, law enforcement, and business leaders. Even as authorities cracked down on the cartel's operations, corruption and violence continued to hinder progress. Rival cartels, seeing the power vacuum left by El Chapo's fall, began to compete for dominance, resulting in a violent shift in the balance of power. The influence of the Sinaloa cartel persisted, even as it fragmented. Moreover, The legacy of El Chapo's operations extended beyond the borders of Mexico. His drug shipments, spanning across continents, continued to impact the U.S., Europe, and other regions. While his empire may have been significantly diminished, the networks that once facilitated the smuggling of cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin remained active, adapting to new routes and methods to evade authorities. His criminal empire had given rise to a new generation of drug traffickers who learned from El Chapo's methods and sought to maintain the lucrative trade he had once commanded. The end of El Chapo's tunnel system didn't signify the end of the war on drugs, nor did it signal a return to order. Instead, his capture illuminated the deep, systemic issues that allowed his empire to thrive for so long. The structures of power, corruption, and violence that he built could not be undone overnight. Though El Chapo's name had become synonymous with the drug trade, the effects of his reign would continue to echo through the streets of both Mexico and the world for years to come. The end of the tunnel did not mean the end of the fight. El Chapo's legacy is a multifaceted one, painted in both darkness and intrigue, and it will be remembered long after his capture. As the tunneling short king, his empire wasn't just built on bloodshed and violence. It was built on ingenuity, secrecy, and a near-superhuman ability to escape justice. His famous tunnels, which allowed him to evade capture time and time again, became a symbol of his reign, cementing his reputation as a criminal mastermind. These underground passages were not just physical routes for transporting drugs. They were representations of El Chapo's defiance of both the authorities and the system. With each escape, each tunnel he built, he grew larger in the eyes of his followers and the public alike, further solidifying the myth that surrounded him. His rise from a humble farm boy in Sinaloa to one of the most powerful and feared figures in the world is a testament to his ruthless ambition and unyielding determination. El Chapo's ability to rise to power within the world of drug trafficking, build the Sinaloa cartel into a global force, and maintain that position for so long left a permanent mark on the drug trade. He had a unique understanding of logistics, territorial control, and the need to be unpredictable. His operations were vast, spanning continents, and his control over the drug flow into the United States, one of the most lucrative markets for narcotics, made him a king in the shadows. Yet, despite his seemingly untouchable empire, his fall was inevitable. The myth of El Chapo that he could never be caught, that he was invincible, was ultimately his downfall. As his empire grew, so did the targets on his back. His escapes from prisons, the tunnels that facilitated those escapes, and the violence he orchestrated to maintain his power became part of a larger narrative that played out both in the media and on the streets. The mythologizing of El Chapo, particularly his role as a clever tactician in the drug trade, created an almost hero-like figure for some. His ability to outsmart the authorities and maintain control over such a vast criminal network turned him into a cultural icon in his own right. In pop culture, El Chapo became both a cautionary tale and a symbol of power. He was immortalized in narco corridos, TV shows, documentaries, and movies. His story, which was both larger than life and terrifyingly real, inspired countless discussions about the nature of power, corruption, and survival. But the legend of El Chapo also served as a stark reminder of the violence and destruction that the drug trade leaves in its wake. His reign may have ended in a prison cell, but the legacy of his criminal network and the myth surrounding him will continue to shape the narrative of organized crime for generations. Ultimately, El Chapo's rise and fall reshaped the landscape of the drug trade and left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness. His empire may have crumbled, but the tunnels he built, both literal and metaphorical, remain a testament to a man who once seemed untouchable, a king whose story is far from over.